Lorraine and Bobby, but it's just been a spectacular opportunity for us to feel like the discussion we're having is grounded in the university, grounded in HBCU, grounded in the work that you're doing here in Durham. And it's been just a perfect marriage for us to have this time together. So what is the Square One Project? It's hard to have the proverbial elevator speech for what the Square One Project is, but I'm going to try my best. The Square One Project represents a 3-year effort that we hope will extend beyond 3 years to bring together people who from different perspectives, whether academic or community organizing or working in different policy organizations or practitioners, are willing to work together to reimagine justice. That's our tagline. Our tagline is reimagine justice, or the one that we've given it since we've been here is hashtag we don't tinker. We're not looking only to fix the current system because we think the current system is inherently flawed, problematic, damaging, and infused with the nation's history of dealing imperfectly with issues of race. So the Square One Project starts with that big idea, which is we would like to work on behalf of our country and on behalf of the communities and individuals represented around the table to reimagine justice. So how are we going to do that? We have 2 methodologies underway. One is an executive session, and if you know that format that comes out of the Kennedy School at Harvard, it's a 3-year closed-door discussion of 24 plus people who are working at a pretty deep level about developing new ideas that are then published in papers that hopefully are transformative. That's the hope. And my colleague in this work, Bruce Western, who's just come to Columbia from the Kennedy School and who has facilitated a number of executive sessions. I've been part of some myself. When we sat down and thought about the Square One Project, and we thought, oh, executive session, we know how to do that. We immediately said, yes, but we need something much bigger than that because the goal is to be transformative, not just informative. Is to really help change people's ways of thinking about what's possible. So we are now married in executive session with a roundtable. The roundtable, as you see, is a outward-facing, public engaging, now Twitter-friendly process of taking on some of the issues that are consistent with our ambition of reimagining justice. We have identified a number of hurdles that we think have to be grappled with in order for us to do the work of reimagining justice. And depending on how you count, there are 3 or 4. The first one that we're talking about today is the legacy of slavery and race and white supremacy in our country as it impacts our ability to think creatively about different ways to respond when something goes wrong, that thing that we call a crime. Can we imagine ways that we could respond that are healing, that respect human dignity of all involved, that are diagnostic in the sense of trying to figure out why did this happen, and that use state power sparingly. So we have to get through the legacy of slavery. Not through it, we can never get through it, but have to come to grips with it. That's what we're doing these 2 days. We also recognize we have to take on the issue of poverty and the ways in which the communities that are of concern to us are also struggling with poverty and services that don't work. We also want to take on the issue of violence. That will be one of our roundtables. We'll come to at some point when we worked out our schedule. And we also recognize that we need to come to grips with the inadequacies of our current legal construct. We created a system to respond to crime called the criminal justice system. It is both inadequate and damaging. Another way of talking about this is we live in an era of punitive excess when we punish too much, too hard, and disproportionately to whatever was the harm caused. So those 4 big issues we want to take on over the next 3 years. Think about them, bring people together, write about them, and engage wider and wider communities to help reimagine justice. The final thing I'll say before turning it over to Daryl is that we do this recognizing this is a time in our nation's history when this idea actually has legs, as they say. We're not alone. There are a lot of people around the country who are doing similar work, and we want to reconnect with them. Some of them are around this table. We want to connect with them. Some of them are around this table. We know also that there's a robust criminal justice reform movement underway that's operates at all levels of policymaking and at the sort of ground truth level, community level. There's also a very robust movement that is challenging the basic assumptions of the way what we've constructed. So this seems to be the right time to do this work. And that's why Bruce and I and Catherine Huffman is the executive director of the Square One Project, and our team, where's Suki? Yep, Suki McMahon, and where's Anamika? Somewhere. There she is. The two of them are helping us with this project. So as we move the roundtable around the country, we're trying for the first time, it was a natural because of Daryl and Judge Trosh, who's also a member of our executive session, to think about what we're about to do, which is to look out beyond our walls. And you people are doing the hard work. You're about to do really hard work. And hoping that we can learn from what's happening here in Durham and that you will inform our thinking. So that's who we are. That's why we're here. And we're delighted to have you here. And I'm particularly delighted to turn the floor, microphone, whatever it is, over to Barrett.
Thanks, Jeremy. You know, when I was privileged enough to be part of the executive session, and when they announced that the first roundtable was coming to Durham, I lobbied pretty aggressively for this session to happen, because I was cognizant of the conditions that currently exist right now in Durham, and conditions that many of you around the table have been working for a long time. I'm looking at Judge O'Neill and Judge Hudson, and I don't know whether to call you Judge Morey or Legislator Morey or Representative Morey. I don't know which one, but I know you all have been working on this stuff for a long time. And we currently have conditions in place where the key institutional stakeholders that run the various components that really kind of drive mass criminalization, those stakeholders are thinking about doing stuff radically different. And so we've been having a conversation for the last day and a half about some really heavy, broad theoretical concepts. Now, how do we operationalize that on the ground? How do we make starting anew from square one a reality with stakeholders who have an appetite for reform, who have an appetite right now for innovation and experimentation? How do we make square one a reality? That's the container that I hope to create. In no way, shape, or form, and any way some expert on what justice in Durham is going to look like. We're going to kind of co-create that together. And we got various components here from law enforcement, from the judiciary, from the prosecutor's office, as well as political components that help create the conditions that we now have with, a pretty progressive mayor and city council, as well as these various components in our system, in the criminal justice system. So run of show, I'm going to go quickly down our list so our people who may not know you all as well as I do, so they can get to know you a little bit better, name, rank, serial number, and then we'll probably get into some more in-depth about the work that's currently been happening and how Durham has stood out as a progressive beacon of reform in the state of North Carolina. And then I hope that we could then transition based on the foundation that has been built. What do we want to do now? I was talking to Allison Grind, who I know from cutting my teeth at IDS in the indigent defense world. I'm a recovering public defender, and knowing her and the work that she did in that realm, and now she's going to be joining Satana's leadership. We were talking about wow, the table is set. The things that we had talked about 6 years ago, we now really have the opportunity to do them. And so I hope the next part of that conversation, we can then talk about what does operationalizing square one look like? How can we then take these steps towards radical transformation? Because we do not tinker. Hashtag we do not tinker. So I'm just going to go down the participant list, and if folks could just introduce themselves, and then we'll proceed forward. Judge Maris.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I want to thank Square One Project for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here, and I think this is a laudable and overdue effort. I am one of your judges. I'm your newest judge here in Durham. I have been a judge since I was appointed by the governor last year to fill the vacant seat of now Representative Morey. So I'm just happy to be here among you and listen. Thank you.
Captain Addison.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Addison. I'm also a graduate of the North Carolina Central University School of Law. I've been a captain with the Durham City Police Department for over 20 years. So I'm vested in this community.
Megan Gonzalez-Smith.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Gonzalez-Smith. I'm co-president of Durham People's Alliance, which is a grassroots political activism and advocacy group in Durham. It's about 42 years old. And I'm also a co-founder of a new organization in Durham, the Durham Public Schools Foundation, working on more equitable outcomes for our public school students in Durham.
Thank you. Marsha Morey.
Welcome to Durham, everyone, and thank you so much for this. This is great. I was a district court judge for 18 years, assistant DA in juvenile law here in Durham, and left the bench to now become known as the lady from Durham, who has to beg to speak. So I'm in the State House, brand new, but it's great to be here.
Marion Johnson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marion Johnson. I am a consultant for Frontline Solutions, which is a Black-owned social justice consulting firm. I'm also co-president with Megan of the Durham People's Alliance, and recently, really excited about this, recently appointed to Durham's new participatory budgeting steering committee. And I'm very excited to be here and to learn from you all today.
Omar Beasley.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Omar Beasley. I'm the chairman of the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People. And I'm gonna go ahead and throw a bullseye on my back now. I'm a bail bondsman. Been a bail bondsman here in this community for over 27 years. And I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. First opportunity to be at a conversation like this from the field that I sit in.
Now, appreciate that, Omar. And what Omar modeled is something that I want us all to embrace, lean into discomfort. So I appreciate you modeling that for us, Omar. Mr. Orlando Hudson.
Yes, I'm Judge Hudson. I'm the senior resident Superior Court judge in Durham. I've been a judge for 34 years. I'm a recovering public defender, a recovering prosecutor, a recovering district court judge. I can't wait for Prosecutor DeBerry to come in with some new plans. We're gonna try to work with you, Omar. There are going to be some real changes in Durham.
No, thank you for that, Judge. Peggy Nicholson.
I'm Peggy. I am one of the co-directors of the Youth Justice Project, which is part of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice based here in Durham. The Youth Justice Project works on a lot of issues impacting youth, including the school to prison pipeline and the criminalization of young people by our education and criminal systems.
Ms. Satana DeBerry.
I'm Satana DeBerry. I'm a candidate for district attorney in Durham County. Actually, I'm the only candidate right now for district attorney.
Do you want to predict the outcome?
As my grandma would say, the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise. Come January 1, I'll be Durham's district attorney. Thank you.
Mr. Scott Holmes, Professor Holmes.
Well, Scott, please. I'm Scott Holmes. I'm a local lawyer, Quaker, unofficial troublemaker in Durham. And my concerns are with poor folks, people of color, protesters. I defend lots of protesters. And I've just been in the community a long time working on these issues, and I'm glad to be a part of the conversation.
Judge O'Neill, I know folks have heard from you, but if it would feel improper to have a discussion about Durham and justice and not give you words.
Welcome to Durham, everybody. Hometown.
So I'm going to point out at least a couple of benchmarks that for me indicate some of the conditions that we're talking about and the time that it took us to get to this point. So Durham was the first city to ban the box in the state of North Carolina in 2010. We were probably the first city to institute mandatory written consent, and that happened in about 2013, 2014. And that's requires police officers, when they're asking for consent to search, they have to give a written form for people to sign away their constitutional rights. Judge Morey, through her advocacy, started the misdemeanor diversion project, because North Carolina was only one of the outliers in the country in continuing to prosecute 16 and 17-year-olds, children as adults. And to interrupt that, we started the misdemeanor diversion project to try to relieve that burden on folks. And now and I'm sure there are many other things that we could point to, but I'm just naming a few. And now we're on the cusp of electing a reform-minded district attorney, as well as a reform-minded sheriff. So in many ways, what we've been doing and the advocacy that we've been doing, and both internally, because I know advocacy happens both inside the system and outside the system, have set the conditions for what we have right now to engage in some experimentation and to begin to think about doing something radically different. I'll pause right there for any other important benchmarks that we may need to put on the table for folks who aren't from Durham that point to areas of progressive reform that we've been working towards for a long time. And I'm asking my Durham co-conspirators to interject and to put forth ideas. Things that I might have left out that point to why Durham is the absolute place, the right place to begin experimentation at the local level.
Sorry. I mean, folks around the table have worked on some of these things, so I feel weird being to note them. But another thing that happened was that we started, there was a time when we were citing panhandlers to court and to jail, and Judge Morey redirected the efforts to prosecute poor people for begging toward a community life court, and that evolved into a traffic ticket forgiveness program that also has assisted folks. And so there was a concern in our district courts for criminalization of poverty, and the judges around the table and the prosecutor who's currently there began small and have moved that progressively bigger to try to help both with traffic tickets and things like, you know, impeding traffic, solicitation, begging, and that sort of thing. So there have been some efforts to reduce the criminalization of poverty in our courts.
Yes, sir.
I'm struggling now to remember the name of a program that I encountered this last spring. There's a program that helps folks who are incarcerated once they leave to get connected to community services in ways that would help them stay out of the jail or get back into the community. And I get the name of the program and folks downtown who work in that. And I think Durham is an innovator in that regard.
So the Criminal Justice Resource Center downtown worked in coalition with the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham to create circles of support for people coming out of prison. And they have volunteer churches that create faith teams, which are groups of people who volunteer to journey with people coming out of prison in order to help with the reentry process. One of the things that I helped start was kind of an advanced version of that called COSA, Circles of Support and Accountability for Sex Offenders. And what we did in that program was identify the folks who are the highest risk of repeat offense and have specially trained volunteers to form a circle around them, and then have an outer circle with professionals, probation officers, psychiatrists, and that sort of a lawyer. And what we learned about that was that reduced the risk of recidivism by 70%. We learned that from Canadian model where they implemented those circles of support for sex offenders. And so Durham is a leader in circles of support for people coming out of prison, both through the Faith Team program and the circles of support and accountability that's in coalition between the Religious Coalition Nonviolent Durham and the Criminal Justice Resource Center.
No, I appreciate you, Scott, bringing the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham into the space, because they've been working on restorative justice kind of models and practices. I remember even before we had any formal restorative justice programs, one of the most powerful moments in court was in Judge O'Neill's court, when it was that really, really horrific case where someone was driving drunk and had killed someone on I-40. and those two families had come together, no prison time, and they came to this agreement themselves through the help of stakeholders. But it was a remarkable moment to see restorative justice in practice. Judge O'Neill, I don't know if you have any reflections about that particular case or that day and how we could maybe operationalize that to scale.
Well, I think restorative justice is one of those areas that we've had a footprint in Durham. Right before I left the bench, I took the first felony plea as a part of restorative justice in Durham County. And basically, the work for me was really easy. It was a standard plea. It was the things that had happened beforehand that made it unique when you had the religious coalition coming together along with the victim and the defendant, and they came up with a plan of action. He still went on probation, but a lot of it centered around restoring the community and making sure that the community felt safe. And most importantly, the child, it was a child victim. Opportunity to sit down with the young man, and they had dinner. He bought gifts. It was just a wonderful time. And then for the young man, he was held accountable, but there was also that healing element for him as a defendant. So restorative justice is one of the places that I think that if we can operationalize that on a wider scale, that it definitely has ramifications, good ramifications around reinventing what justice looks like.
And I've been working with the restorative justice. I teach it here at Central, but we also have been working with Marcia Owen and the Religious Coalition for about 5 years to try to bring restorative justice to Durham and implement it in courts. And if the question is how you reimagine justice, that's a good place to begin, because instead of a hammer and nail, crime and punishment, guilt and sentence, restorative justice first asks the question, who's been harmed? And that's not the question the criminal justice system first asks, it's who done it. But if you ask the question, who's been harmed, and then you ask, how do we heal that harm? And that's how you define what a crime is, then many of the things that we're putting in people in jail for are not crimes. They're failures of our mental health system, they're failures of our employment system, they're failures of our education system. But the first question is who's been harmed and how do we help? And the second question goes to the person who caused the harm, and it's why did you do it? And can you accept responsibility and be accountable to the person you've harmed? And then the third question is, how do we get the community members, the stakeholders who've also been harmed by this, involved in the process that resolves the conflict? So the conflict stays in the hands of the people who are most directly impacted by it, and it's not taken over by the state. And the way that looks in practice are circle processes, a pre-conference meeting with a person who's been harmed to ask them how they've been harmed by the facilitator, a meeting with a person who caused the harm separately to figure out how they can be held accountable and why they did it, meeting with community members and pre-conferencing to figure out how they've been impacted and how they might be willing to help these folks. And then finally, a circle process that brings all those people together to, in a guided facilitation, address how the harm occurred, how it could be healed, and how the person could be accountable, and how the community can participate in that accountability. And then an agreement that comes out of that, that then people can follow up on and then take to a court. And that process of reimagining both the process of crime and the outcomes as built around the idea that we're interrelated, that no one's indispensable, that nobody can be kicked out of our community, and that the goal of the criminal justice system is not to identify who done it and put them in prison, but it's to empower the people who've been harmed by that to have a process in which they can heal that harm in the community.
I would like to jump in and say the questions that you say we should be asking, I think are really crucial questions. You're like, who's been harmed? Why did you do it? And will you be held accountable for it? But I don't believe that the criminal justice system has any incentives to be asking those questions first. I think we're operating in a capitalist structure that really incentivizes punishment. And that's especially true when you have systems like we have in North Carolina. Like the state government keeps on cutting taxes to the point that instead of getting all of our funding in Durham from taxes, we're getting it from fines, fees, and punishment. And so doing things that seem completely neutral, like cutting taxes, is actually falling disproportionately hard on people who are already involved in the criminal justice system anyway. And it's disproportionately Black and brown people. And so these completely neutral seeming policies that don't seem connected to everyday people at all and don't seem connected to the criminal justice system are actually having direct and really harmful effects on us. And it's making it hard for the system to ask the questions that need to be asked.
No, thank you for bringing that in, Mary. And I want to get Judge Hudson in the conversation because most recently, I forget, maybe a year or two ago, the General Assembly passed a law that required both superior and district court judges to make written findings of when they wanted to waive or remit fees, right? To almost create a chilling effect so you don't waive or remit fees because we're using poor people as a regressive tax to fund the courts. In your position on the bench, has that proven to be true? Has it created a chilling effect for judges to actually remit fees and not really assess people's ability to pay?
Well, it creates a chilling effect for people who believe it's constitutional, but most of us don't believe it's constitutional and we don't do it. So the next step is, what kind of punishment are they gonna impose on judges who fail to follow it? And there could be some punishment. I don't know. Republican-led legislature, they could come up with any kind of ideas to do this. So make it a criminal offense.
Well, can I just chime in there for a second? I think the punishment we've seen just is what happened in Wake County and Mecklenburg County, which is we'll just redistrict you out of office if we're dissatisfied with your refusal to abide by our legislation that requires you to collect money from poor people to go into the general fund. But I agree with Judge Hudson that I think that actually across the state, and it's clear in our conferences, that this is not having a chilling effect on exercising our constitutional responsibility to determine ability to pay, to not impose costs and fines that people cannot afford, and to not jail people as a result of their inability to pay some kind of financial compensation.
Judge Morey, I saw you chomping at the bit, ready to get in.
Now I'm part of the other side. But no, and Daryl, you're right. And things are systematic. And if you look at the history with these fines and fees, first we could do it. We could waive it. And all you did is waive the costs if you found just cause. And then you had to write for just cause. And then the AOC started keeping a scorecard or a shame card on judges. And it would give the percent. Judge Morey waived, 82% of all costs and fines. Some judge in some other county waived 15%. And then the most recent law, which was passed last year, you had to give notice to every governmental agency that would be affected if you waived a traffic cost or a fine to the school board. So there's like 180 some entities in the state. You have to give notice in letter that you're thinking about waiving a fine or a fee before you do it. It's a train wreck. So I think judges and chief judges have written administrative orders to get around it. But there is real animus in our General Assembly towards our court system, the redistricting, the judicial constitutional amendment coming on, and we have to repair that and allow local communities judges to have discretion, which being a judge is all about.
I just ask if somebody is drafting a constitutional challenge to
Yeah.
that statute.
Yeah, I've already challenged it.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Local attorneys down there.
Yeah,
Make sure
but
this- okay.
But the challenge is actually interested in, it kind of connects it to education, because under our North Carolina Constitution, any money that is a penalty is supposed to go to the schools. But if you look at our court cost statute, it's sending the money to things like the sheriff's retirement fund and the technology in court and that sort of thing. And so once we get a hearing on it, which we've had a challenge getting it in front of a court, but the Constitution is pretty clear that all of the court cost money and these fines money that are currently supporting and paying for our court system on the backs of poor people, that money is actually supposed to go to schools. And they're then supposed to separately fund our courts, not on the backs of poor people who are brought to court.
I want to bring Megan into the conversation, and particularly, I was struck by something that Judge Morey said, that she had an 80% waiver rate. And I want to talk about some of the PA's work in helping educate community to where that 80% waiver rate isn't a shield, it's a sword, right? Where you can actually go to the community and say, judges like Judge Morey are not extracting wealth from poor and Black, brown communities
Right.
through community education to then empower folks to make different electoral choices.
Yep, exactly. So that is exactly one of the conversations we're having in PA right now as a grassroots community group. How do we do exactly that? So how can we be educating the community and lifting up our judges that weigh fines and fees as something that we celebrate and use that to build public support for them, and also to educate the community about what this means. What are these fines and fees? How are they disproportionately affecting people of color and people in poverty in our community? And where are we seeing our judges use their discretion in a way that we really want to celebrate? So it's really one of our top priorities in PA right now. One of the things we're talking about and talking with other organizations in the community that we partner with. We have our really first event very targeted on this conversation next week. So Representative Morey will be there. Our DA-elect will be there. Beginning to educate the community about what this means. But it's certainly something, and like we want to be in ongoing conversation with the folks around this table about how we can educate and build really grassroots support among voters and use this as a way to build support for our judges who are doing this.
And Judge Maris, you've been doing some work around trying to address the fee and fine situation from a different posture, because very often people will get a relatively benign driving without a seatbelt. They fall into the driving while license suspended, driving while license revoked spiral, right? And in a jurisdiction like this that doesn't have good transportation, your ability to drive is a lifeline. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you're pioneering and trying to help restore people's ability to drive so they can access opportunity?
Sure. Thanks, Daryl. So first of all, as a judge, our roles are very specific in what we can do. And so what I have done since January is convened stakeholders in this community that are invested in issues that have to do with driver's license restoration, that have to do with expunction access and certificates of relief. And I think the fundamental question that everybody is talking about here, and I'm sure you've been talking about the past day and a half that I've missed, is if you don't understand the system to be inherently flawed, if you don't understand, I'm going to step back just a little bit. If you don't understand that we have next year the 200-year anniversary of our Supreme Court, yet 200 years ago, there was only one among us that was considered a full citizen, and that is the system that we are still operating in today. And so what are we celebrating next year? And where have we come from? And so all of these questions that are being talked about, and there are a few other really compelling projects that have happened in Durham that haven't been mentioned yet, like mental health court, and that CJRC, their Criminal Justice Resource Center, just this week got a huge grant to expand reentry services around mental health. And Bull City United, which deals with empowering people in the community to be violence interrupters, to anticipate gang violence, and to, instead of having law enforcement involved in that component, the violence interrupters go and meet with people and say, but before you retaliate, can we work out a truce? There are so many very compelling, innovative things happening in Durham. And so that brings me to your question, Daryl, which is last year, before I convened parties, the DA's office was working with North Carolina Justice Center and with some other parties about driver's license restoration. And so as a judge, we receive cases that come before us. We cannot say that we would blanketly remit costs for every case. That would be improper. We cannot say that we would give a certain ruling on any case. That would be improper. What we can say is that we will evaluate every motion before us, if it is a motion to remit fees based on what the law allows, rest in the Constitution, rest in Bearden versus Georgia that says that we have to consider ability to pay an imposition of fine or remittal of fine. And so with respect to driver's licenses, I don't think it takes much thought to realize that if you don't have access to a driver's license, you don't have access to the fundamental things in life. In a place like North Carolina, we've had problems with mass transit. You will have access with employment. And we are talking about not just one individual, but all of their loved ones that rely on them for income, their families. We're talking about perpetuating generational poverty. And so the driver's license itself is symbolic and inherent to this issue of how do we see people and how does the justice system treat people in the system? Do we strictly construe the law in the sentencing fashion, or do we construe the law in the constitutional sense to empower everyone to have equal access to the system? So we convened parties in January to look at how could we come up with a court referral program to identify parties who are eligible for expunctions and certificates for leave, and also to provide driver's license restoration mechanisms. We have been meeting since January. This program will be launching in Durham with the financial support of the city of Durham. It will be called the Durham Expunction Restoration Program, or DEAR. And we will be, for the first time in the state, finding people in the courtroom when they are eligible, their charges dismissed, send them to the office to be processed, to have their expunctions processed. And there will also be initiatives to bring immense motions to remit monies to all judges to hear on a case-by-case basis, and to try and get people back on equal footing in a system that did not start out on equal footing. And until we start taking innovative measures to address that, in my opinion, we are not the justice system. What is the justice system? We have in Durham right now over 14,000 people who don't have a license, and that is due to failure to pay a fine. And I believe that the figures were at least over 60% were African Americans. And so when you start talking about that, and you start looking at those figures and the statistics do not lie, you have got to start taking innovative measures. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a program that will be in place, and it is the product of multiple partners. It is a product of partners here at NCCU Law School. It is a product of partners at Duke Law School. It is a product of the Equal Access to Justice Commission. It is a product of working with community partners. We are still developing with potentially with All of Us or None, which Daryl is a part of, and Forward Justice. There are countless other partners. But this is what we're trying to do, is say justice doesn't stop. When your case ends, it doesn't stop. When the courtroom doors close, we've got to bring you access to relief that removes the stain and gets you back to work and equals the playing field.
Thank you, Judge Maris. So for the folks who aren't Durhamites, you've gotten a taste of the milieu of innovations that's happening in the jurisdiction. I want to kind of pivot now to, that's what we've done. What do we want to do? If you had no restrictions, right? If we had the ability to do whatever we wanted to do, what would that be? Would we end money bail? Would we rapidly or radically expand diversion? 85% of the case types that come into our district court, misdemeanor and traffic. You factor in the bottom two felony classes, you at 94% of the case types. If we took all of that noise out of the system, what could we really do with our court resources to go deep on some of these cases that really, really matter to people when it comes to public safety? So I'm going to shift to you now, Ms. D. Barrett, on what are you thinking about doing as far as interrupting some of the status quo in the system that we've been seeing?
Yeah, so I don't even know where to start. So we know that culture has to change around criminal justice. We live here in Durham County. There's 100 years of Black political power. And yet our criminal justice outcomes look exactly the same as they do anywhere else in this country. And why is that? Because if you go right now down to the Durham County Courthouse and you walk into a courtroom, it is likely that the judge is Black, the prosecutor is Black, the defense counsel is Black, victims are Black, defendants are Black, bailiffs are Black, arresting officers. Everybody in this situation is a Black person. And I guarantee you that when you take each one of those people out of their uniform, out of their suit, you take them outside of the courthouse, every one of them will tell you that the system is messed up. Yet when we go back into into the actors that we are in the system, we perpetuate the system. And why is that? And so what we want to do in the DA's office is think about how do we change the way we look at the system? As probably perhaps, Judge Maris says, judges are restricted by what they can do, right? They have a box within they have to live. Law enforcement has a box within which they have to live. The only actors in this system who don't really have a box in which they have to live are the prosecutors. And so how do we, as the prosecutors, lead change? How do we think about who we prosecute, why we prosecute them, and how we prosecute them? Do we just accept cases from law enforcement without any evaluation, right? Or are we an office that's committed to evaluating each case, working with law enforcement around investigations, really understanding what we are doing. I think as we get further into this transition, one of the things that we're learning is that the system moves very quickly and very slowly, right? So it moves very quickly to prosecute the least of us and very slowly in prosecuting those people that we really want to hold accountable in our community. And so you can't have it both ways. We either say we don't have the time or we do have the time. And so we want to do that. Daryl mentioned Allison Grind. I want to give Allison a shout out. She's here. She's actually my first hire. And although technically I cannot hire anybody.
Will be.
So Allison and I and some other folks have been working, have been volunteering with people of Durham County and thinking about what we're going to do. And one of the reasons that Allison was one of the first people who agreed to join my team is because we really want to think about the equity in the work that we do. Allison literally wrote the book on implicit bias in North Carolina. And so our idea was that as a district attorney's office, we look at our bias and how we prosecute, who we prosecute, and how we look at power and equity within our office. It is not lost on me that most junior people in the current prosecutor's office are women. And the most junior and most low paid people in the current office are Black women. And so what does it mean in a system where the people with the least, even the least amount of prosecutorial power look the same as people in the courtroom? Right? What's it going to mean for, we've taught our leadership team is currently scheduling an equity training for ourselves. Because it is one thing for folks to be justice-minded and reform-minded and say, yes, Satana, I'm all in on your vision, and then have to come to work every day and work for a Black woman, right? You can say you can do that, but you don't know what you don't know about yourself and your own personal lives. Right? And, I have a team leadership style. We're working together. We're working with members of the community. But at the end of the day, right, Mr. Troy, I'm the elected, right? And so I have to make the decisions. And so what is that going to mean when that person with that power in our community is a Black woman, right? And how we talk about that. So we're about data, knowing what we do. We're about cultural change. And we're about being more visible in this community around the work that we do.
No, thank you for that. Judge Hudson, I'm coming back to you. The issue of money bail has gained national traction. And I want to give a special shout out because we have a strong song affiliate in Durham, Southerners on the New Ground. I think they've done tremendous work in helping to change the narrative and how we talk about people who are held in pretrial detention. And what I'm referring to is the Black Mama bailouts. And the reason culturally that was so significant, if you looked at the number of women who were bailed out and you looked at the impact on the one-day snapshot of the 750,000 people who are held in city and county facilities, and you looked at their impact that way, you would be missing it, right? But if you look at the change in vernacular that we use, we're calling them Black mamas. We're not calling them pretrial detainees. We're not calling them, convicts or defendants. We're calling them mothers. And that was a huge narrative and cultural shift that has helped usher in some of the prominence around this money bail issue. But Judge Hudson, the senior resident, controls the bond schedule. What are your thoughts around money bail and any potential changes that may be afoot in that regard?
Well, there has to be a cultural change, and that's what's going to happen in Durham. You pointed out that Durham has a history of having a Black DA. Ms. DeBerry won't be the first Black DA.
Won't even be the second.
I've been the senior resident judge for 25 years. What's going to happen is it has to be a cultural change. I looked at proposed bond policy that Ms. DeBerry is going to institute. you know what? She really doesn't need it. Because all it does is point out what the North Carolina law already is. The problem is the law is not practiced the way it should be. And so we're going to practice it the way it should be. And we'll see how it comes out. Now, one of the things I think Ms. Johnson talked about is how do you go about committing change? We got Black judges, Black prosecutors elected, but they gotta stay elected. And see, some of you are not from North Carolina, maybe you don't know it, but all our judges are elected officials. And when we make decisions that some people don't like, we are the subject of TV commercials, which all you gotta do is turn on your television now, even in Durham, and some judges' pictures on a commercial for making an improper decision. So we need the People's Alliance. We need Omar, who's head of the Durham Committee, another organization very much involved in supporting candidates to point out what it is that we need, but we need support. We need elective support.
No, I think that's a critical point, Judge Hudson, and something that we absolutely have to build into the implementation of Square One. If we're gonna usher in this environment to encourage electeds, judges, prosecutors to take risks, we have to have the political insulation for them to protect them when they do take risks. Because we all know that just like any other business, there are gonna be some bad outcomes, right? People are gonna remember the one person that was let out who does something, not the 99 that you let out who didn't do something. So how do we build the political insulation? I think that has to be a key component of starting from square one to protect stakeholders who are willing to take risks. I think that's a key part of it. Captain Addison, I want to pull you in on your perspective of DPD and some of the things that the police department wants to do. Police serve as, in many instances, as first contact with getting people potentially either involved in the system or not involved in the system. What is DPD thinking about doing to usher in this, to ride this wave of reform?
To talk about what we're going to do, we have to look back at our past. You know, when you look at law enforcement, it has been infused people with agendas, whether they be racial, whatever bias they have. Every now and then, you have to stand at the gate. We have an exodus in law enforcement now where people don't want to do this job. This is not that sexy fireman job. I have to go places where people don't want to go. So in order to make change, you have to be a part of that change. If not, you're just giving me lip service. I need more people to become police officers. Just like we need more people to become district attorneys, and we need more people to become judges. It starts at the very bottom. What we've done in the Durham Police Department is every opportunity we've had to make a difference, to try to level the playing field we have. With the misdemeanor diversion project, where I'm going to, when I get done with this meeting, speak to juveniles about having that second shot. We want to make sure we understand that the system is not set up for Black and brown children to succeed. So we're trying to give every opportunity we can. So when these programs come about that we know we're going to level the playing field, not giving one person a severe advantage over another, but to level the playing field. Because I believe if we can just level the playing field, everything else will work itself out. But when you start 500 yards behind someone else, you have to catch up first. It's never fair, even if you win. So every program that we have an opportunity to participate in to make sure that we're leveling the playing field to give our kids a chance, a better shot, we do.
So I'm going to lean into the discomfort a little bit.
I'm never just.
I'm going to lean into the discomfort a little bit and bring up a topic, at least that I know during my time in Durham has been a source of policing community tensions, and it involves officer uses of force. I think over the past 8 years, we've had maybe 10 officer-involved killings. And that's not to mention the officer-involved uses of force. I can remember the John Hill case, that Scott litigated in front of Judge Morey. I saw John maybe a few weeks ago. He's still scuffling a little bit. But thinking about those most, I guess, potentially inflammatory instances that can really be divisive moments, right, between police and community. My wife always tells me, Daryl, you need to put something in the bank for when something bad happens. So I got some currency to draw on when I'm thinking about you. How do the police put something in the bank with community so they have some currency to draw on when that bad thing happens, so we don't have these really frayed community and police relationships?
Very good question. That investment that we're talking about requires that you go into a community when there's not something to enforce. When you're there just to be present, to get to know the community. You know, one thing I applaud Chief Davis for is that we're infused in the community. We try. Now, can we go through every door? Some doors we're not able to. Some people don't want us there. And we respectfully understand that every opportunity we have, we try to. Because when people see you when you're not doing law enforcement activity and they get to understand the officer, the individual, the officer that participates in PALs, or the one that shows up at the community meeting and plays with the kids or gets out the car and talks to the community, that's that investment you're talking about in the bank. So when unfortunately we have to go in there and to enforce the law or to make an arrest, they see the person and not just the badge.
One of the things, thank you for that. One of the things we discussed earlier, and we were talking about diversity and how diversity can potentially be a tool to transform systems. I reflected on some of our foster and alternative drug enforcement work and some of the anti-racial profiling work that we were doing in the community, and how Black folks were being searched at much higher rates than whites, incident to a routine traffic stop. And this was happening when we had a Black mayor, predominantly Black city council, Puerto Rican police chief, command staff, probably the most diverse in the state. And so my point is, diversity doesn't necessarily translate into equity. Can you all talk about some of the steps that your institutions are taking to address racial equity within your various institutions? And I'll leave that open for anyone who wants to take it up.
Well, I can speak to that for a minute. You know, I met Chief Davis at a race equity training, and I want to commend the Durham County government for paying for it, for multiple department heads and the people that they wanted to send. I was able to go because the public defender at the time that I worked for, I was a public defender for over 10 years before I became a judge. He had already been, and so he allowed me to go. And so I spent about 2.5 days with Chief Davis. We sat together at the lunch table and we talked about, this is at the very beginning of her coming to Durham. And we had some frank discussions about some of the challenges that she would face to bring together the community, the things that you're speaking to, Daryl. And I want to say that these issues that I'm sure you've been discussing here, you know, we're still at the very beginning, in my opinion, of trying to really break open the conversations we need to have. But it does start with all of the key actors, and not just the department heads, but the officers on the street, the public defenders in the courtroom, which is what I was at the time. And you cannot make assumptions that just because you're a public defender, for example, that you understand race equity, especially if you're a white female public defender, and even African American. I think that we've all been, to a large extent, brainwashed, so to speak, about the system that we live in, because it's every system. Our society is built, they're all connected. We learned that in race equity. And so I want to commend Chief Davis because she was there and she participated, and I was really struck by her honesty and what I thought was her genuine intentions for law enforcement on these issues. And so I did say to her over the lunch, I said, well, you know, we really need every officer here. And I believe that it costs for one person to do the race equity training a few $100s per person, I think. And so, you know, we haven't revisited that conversation. I was just a public defender then, as you say. But I think it's all the mentality, right? I think most of the people in this room know what we're talking about, right? But we also have places to grow. I have places to grow, enormous places to grow. So I want to commend Chief Davis, but I think it starts with the mental framework which the easiest option to go to for that is race equity training. That's what we all go to. But there are other places for that. My group started a book group for a while to read more books, to educate ourselves in discussion. So I think it starts with the training, but it starts with it's like in drug treatment court. You can't go if you don't want to go. You can't be sent to go to drug treatment court as a participant if you don't want to go. If you don't want to go there in your mind, you can show up at race equity training and it may not even have the desired effect. So it has to start with all of us saying, we lead to the discomfort forever, because it's not just when you go to training, it's forever. So we go, we talk, and I think Satana is going to bring that to the courthouse. And I hope that some of the training she's going to bring to the prosecutor's office, we can have spread out all throughout the court system, because that's what we need, every actor.
I think part of it also is the hard conversations you have to have. Before I was ever an officer, before I was ever an attorney, I was a Black man. So when an officer pulls up behind me, I get the same angst that everyone else in this room gets, unless I'm in Durham. But if I'm somewhere else, you feel that same way. And I don't say that like I get a special privilege. I just try not to do anything to get stopped. But still, you get that same feeling. But that conversation you have to have with your peers. Because right now in law enforcement, we're being looked at through a microscope. So we have to have these conversations with the younger officers to explain to them. The body cam is a wonderful thing, and some people like it, some people don't. I love it because now there's no he said, she said. Let's play the video. Let's see what transpired. And we're holding people accountable if they don't turn them on when they're supposed to. That investment that we've made, I think, was well worth it. But we have to kind of sit at the gate, not just in Durham Police Department, although we're here, there are departments all across the nation. Someone has to stand at that gate and say, okay, this can't happen anymore. Because unless you're internal to that organization, you only see what's on the news. Somebody has to stand there and say, no more of this is going to happen, not on my watch. And that's where that conversation begins, internally.
Can I just add
Yep.
something? I think it also has to happen across systems, because we're here talking about the criminal justice system, but I know for the young people we work with, the education and criminal justice system are one in a lot of respects, given that they're officers in their schools and they're interacting with police and the court system for school-based offenses, as well as getting suspended. And I know that education folks in Durham Public School are looking at equity and doing racial equity institute training. And I know Judge Trosh in Charlotte has had a lot of success and done a lot of pulling across system stakeholders together to talk about the school to prison pipeline. How do we keep kids in school and deal with behaviors that way? And the mental health system plays a role in that. So I would also just to add on to that, and also put it on my wish list that Daryl asked about earlier, is something that Durham could be even stronger in. It's that kind of across system conversation.
And Peggy, I'm going to go back to you because I hate we didn't get representation from the Sheriff's Department. You brought up school-based offenses and young people. I think if I'm correct, Captain Addison, DPD took all of their SROs out of the school, took all of your officers as SROs out of the school. Is that
I think
correct?
they're slated. I'm not quite sure they've been removed yet.
But they're slated to be removed.
I think.
The Sheriff's Department then would be completely responsible for SROs. What is your thought on the role of SROs in the schools and their appropriate function? And as far as a wish list.
My personal thought is
Leading
that
question.
They shouldn't be there right now because we have no information on what their impact is. They don't keep data there. For the sheriff's office, there's no kind of accountability evaluation mechanism in place. I think Durham, the police department does at least have a written document with the school system that kind of spells out what type of offenses school resource officers from their department should be involved in, and has some data accountability related to that. But they only patrol 3 to 5 schools. I think this school year it's only 3. And the rest is the Sheriff's Department, which has no such document. So no consistent guidance, no data accountability. We don't know which officers are high flyers. We don't know how many Black versus white students are getting referred. So a short-term goal for me would be to have the same type of data-based approach to school policing that Satana's going to bring to the DA's office, and that we ask our educators to have. We have principals, their suspension rates are being held in their faces every day, and they're being held accountable for that. Teachers, their test scores, students, obviously. So why not the same for law enforcement in schools? If they're a program that's supposed to promote safety, let's have some evidence that shows it does.
My wish list would be, just to piggyback on this data piece, right? It is district attorney's offices are historically black boxes, right? During the campaign, I kind of consistently said, who works there, right? Who works in the DA's office? Where's the website? What are you tracking? And that was never addressed, right? I'd say, okay, we're over prosecuting people who are black and brown and poor. And the incumbent would say, I've never prosecuted anybody because they were black or brown and poor. And because we don't have any data, he's absolutely right. Right? Even though we go in every day and we see what is occurring, if we don't have that data. And so while equity training is important and we are building it into our structure, we also need to know what we're doing. And we have not historically even had the tools to do that. I can do more in Google right now than the DA's office can do with his files and his case management. Right? You're asking young attorneys who come in who, at this point, they are half my age and so have spent their whole lives in a technological environment, and you ask them to come back in and use a paper file. And so we'd like to have more ability to develop data, case management system. We'd like to be able to run a modern law office. I can walk into any small law office in this county and have better systems than I have in the district attorney's office. And I am responsible for the safety of this community. Like, what is more important than me knowing what I'm doing? Right? And so that would be top on our list. I know how to do race equity training. I know how to manage people, right? But unless I know what I'm managing them around, we're just shooting in the dark, right? We don't tinker, what, hashtag? We don't tinker, we don't tinker.
I got Scott in the queue, and then I'm gonna ask one last question of Omar because I want to open it up to the rest of the roundtable participants to be able to ask folks some questions. Scott.
One question I have and one challenge that I see is that what's really driving mass incarceration in Durham and countrywide is the war on drugs and the way police departments are structured to get drug arrests. And we look at Durham police budgets and how many drug officers they have and how they're using resources to set up stings and undercover sales in Eastern Durham, but not at Duke University. That what we see is that the war on drugs is what's driving mass incarceration. And so the problem I foresee is that it's going to be really hard. The police can go to every kind of event and put on the best face they can and be good community cooperators and participants. But if their mission is fundamentally the same, which is to lock up poor people of color for drug crimes, then that's not going to change the long-term direction of mass incarceration. And if the DA's office doesn't have a relationship with the police department where they're on the same page about decriminalizing drugs and doing race equity analysis on drug enforcement, then there's going to be a collision that is huge, because not only is the Durham police and other police committed to the war on drugs and have raised several generations of police on the war on drugs, but a lot of their funding in terms of civil forfeitures and money they collect out of drug enforcement funds their ability to get the equipment they need. So my question for revolutionary change is, how do we declare an end to the war on drugs in a context where we have been built on that for centuries, or at least 50 years?
Well, Scott, it's more than just drugs. Mass incarceration starts with a failed bond policy, because the people who are in power are happy when a defendant cannot make bond. And then the prosecutor's office historically views that as being okay, because if the defendant's guilty, then he can just use the fact that he can't get out of jail toward his sentence. He gets jail credit for that. When you're talking about not drugs, but crimes, the victims love it when the defendant can't get out of jail. And so it starts with the fact that throughout this entire policy of prosecuting people, I had a case the other day defendant had been in jail 689 days. So
I got one with 700 days right
yeah,
now.
that's their worst cases. We've seen them all, their worst cases, but you got to get people out of jail so that they can deal with their cases. As you very well know, the fact that you even have a bond system at all, the public doesn't understand, is inconsistent with due process. It's inconsistent with the presumption of innocence. The public does not understand it.
Not to mention the fact that there is no evidence in the research that money bond increases appearance rates or reduces recidivism. Not to mention the fact that the evidence is clear that when low-risk folks are booked into the jail in order to pay a money bond, that first 24 hours in jail increases their risk of recidivism by what is it, Arthur?
24 hours, it's 16%, but after 3 to 4 days, it goes up. In most cities like Durham, I would think would fit in that category, up to 60%. Now, smaller crimes, but still, we're forcing people into tunnels that they don't have any opportunity, because everybody in this room could miss a couple days of work and be fine. When you work at McDonald's or TJ Maxx, that is not the case, and that is what happens to people.
I couldn't have asked for a better segue to my last question to Omar. And we talked about a little bit earlier, some of the potential financial incentives that are embedded within the system that could potentially make starting from square one really, really hard, because people are defending their economic interests. And so, Omar, we've been talking about this issue of money bail. You are a bondsman. From your perspective as a bondsman, how does reform around money bail, what does that look like for you?
It could be detrimental, but I don't see it that way. I've been in this business for 27 years, and my perspective is that I help people. I've gotten calls from Scott Holmes, from protesters. Omar, I need your help. Come get these people out, and I would get them out discounted rates. I've gotten calls from Song. Omar, we need your help, and I will come get people out on discounted rates. So there is a benefit right now. As some people may not see it that way, but I do help people. I reunite families. We reunite people when they don't have the money to get out, let's say on a $10,000 bond where it may cost them $1,500. I can get them out for $400 to $500 and give them their freedom. That's one thing that I can do that some systems that they have, like in Ohio, New Jersey, where they have a system that's set up, and if it's a $10,000 fee, that's what they got to pay. The personal touch that I offer as a bondsman is unique, and it's different from what any system that I've heard thus far that can replace what I do. The money bail system it needs to be reformed. The judicial system, it needs to be reformed. But the question that I've had and I've said for the past few years since this conversation has been brewing up is, what does it look like? What does it look like? Getting some good information in here. And I like what you said earlier is that we got to reimagine it. But again, what does it look like? And I'm open, I'm willing to put the information and knowledge that I have and experience that I have in this conversation, because it definitely needs to change. But where do we go? Where do we start from? Because magistrates, judges, I've seen them all set bonds based on racial biases and prejudices.
Yeah, we're gonna take care of the magistrates.
Yeah. I hope so.
So I want to open it up to other roundtable participants to be able to ask the Durham delegation specific questions or offer insights on what you've heard.
Can I say something about where we go if we don't have money bail? Because that's what we're doing in Mecklenburg, although we're trying to keep it a little bit on the down low so we don't get too much resistance from the legislature. but because we've been successful in implementing, I know there's opportunity for meaningful discussion about the value of risk assessments, but because we have implemented the public safety assessment, which does assess risk of recidivism and failure to appear using objective criteria, and 2 validation studies have shown that it's very predictive of those risks. And 2, there are a lot of people we could just cut loose without any conditions of pretrial release. And it's the 2 rounds of validation have shown that there's no disproportionality at all in that decision point. So when the judge makes the release or detain decision using that as a guide, we are not exacerbating disproportional detention of people of color. So now back to the equity conversation, maybe, but anyway, so that has led us to be able to say, well, like money bond is totally irrational. Why is it that because, I don't know, Catherine can post $10,000 on an assault with a deadly weapon, I feel great about the fact that she's out in the community. And the fact that Jared couldn't post a $500 bond for the same offense, right? So, the answer is we implement a continuum of alternatives to the use of bond to be released from, and we just release people. And we just say, you know what, there's certain things like class 3 misdemeanors, you can't go to jail if you're convicted, you don't go to jail pretrial, the end, not doing it. So you say low risk, see ya, we'll sketch a text message to remind you of your court date, see you in a couple months.
Unlikely I'll ever appear before you. That's why Daryl just whispered to me, you take it from here, Jeremy. So I can just ask us to open up the conversation. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah, but I think
Okay.
there are answers to that.
There'll be apparently a very robust discussion about pretrial release here. So I do want to open up the conversation. So what we're doing now is we're shifting gears for members of the roundtable. We're listening, learning, getting a sense of all of the amazing energy here in Durham to pose some questions. Not so much observations, but really sort of let's help us, all of us, learn from some of our colleagues in Durham. We'll start with Professor Leah Wright-McGurd. You'll see her. Sorry? Yeah, no, we're gonna wait.
Okay.
You'll see bios in your packet. Right down here. Look at this. Bruce, Marlon, Nancy. Okay, Leah.
Oh, thank you. So thank you for this kind of wonderful, for me, I'd call it a little bit more than an introduction to Durham and to what you guys are doing here. And, I would love to hear more about, and please don't take this the wrong way, I would love to hear more about what has failed. And I say that because you guys have given this really impressive list of things that have gone for all purposes has gone right. But I do think, and one of the things maybe we haven't talked so much about in the discussion so far yet, just in general, has been failure. And I do think that failure is useful in thinking about pathways forward, right? So in looking and in analyzing and saying, why didn't this work? What could we do differently? What pathway? The other thing I'm really curious about is that for all I know that you guys could all be the same political affiliation, you could all be, you're in different areas operating, but you seem to have this very cooperative sense or common goal. I'm really interested in how you have taken the politics out of policy and reform and how that functions in Durham and also how it functions much more largely in North Carolina.
So rather than ask for a specific, I'd like to see if there's any commonality between these 4 folks who want to ask questions, and then we'll stack them up and see what sort of responses we get from our Durham colleagues, just in the interest of time and efficiency, and get as many voices in as we can. Bruce, you want to?
I have a separate issue.
No,
I can go.
But I'd like to hear what people would like to know from our Durham colleagues.
Yeah.
Then ask them to, however they want to organize their answers, they'll organize their answers. But let's get all the questions in the room at the same time.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot over the last couple of days about the importance of having some sort of historical reckoning, some sort of settling accounts with the past as a precondition for more fundamental reform moving forward. And I heard Judge Maris touch on this a little bit. I wonder if that sort of process has been any part of all the different reform activity that you've described. How important is it? What did it look like for you if you did it?
So you asked two questions, but there's several. What's failed and what does the spirit of cooperation look like here in Durham? Is there a need for a reckoning with the past? Marla, what do you want to add to the?
First of all, this is very filling. I have to admit that this is extremely filling. So I want to really just sort of affirm all the folks from Durham here that's doing this amazing work. It's really filling. And with that, the thought that comes to my head is, well, one of the articles that was furnished to us was an article about the rise in gun violence in Durham from last year, right? And his opportunity to marry some of the practical from some of the theory. So one of the papers that we read in maybe in your packets from Heather and Thompson speaks to saying that rising crime does not explain the advent of high rates of incarceration because the historical record is replete with cases when crime was not followed by punitive legislation or a national campaign, right? When the question was asked of innovations, when you put that question on the floor of innovations, and we went around the room and folks spoke of various innovations, and we heard specifics around what community folks are doing in the space. And when the question was when it was pointed to Captain Addison, I don't know, I felt a little bit as if the question was not necessarily answering what the innovations were. I think police diversity is not an innovation. And I think that if we are having, here's an interesting opportunity now, where we have a space where we have folks who are doing amazing work, from sexual offenses, which is one of the hardest places to make any sort of inroads, right? To violent offenses in the restorative justice space. Is this a moment here in Durham when we can say, in that same article that I referred to about the violence, there was a person who spoke of the divestment from law enforcement. If we are in a space where we have these amazing things that are happening in a cooperative space from the judiciary to community from lawyers and whatnot, could we even imagine the opportunity here in Durham where we would be able to divest from law enforcement? And I think this is a leaning into a difficult conversation, but we have models that are working here. We have models that are working here, and there are innovations here. How can we, what would it look like in a Durham if we reimagine a divestment from a model that is a little bit lacking in innovation to models that are innovating?
Okay, great. Nancy.
My question is somewhat related. I was intrigued by, Marion, your mentioning of serving on a participatory budgeting working group. And I'm interested in hearing more about that from you and others and how you see that relating to your efforts to promote racial equity in the justice system here in Durham.
Just by way of background, Marion, we've had a number of discussions here about where the money goes.
Gotcha.
And it's a version of Marlon's question, which is, what's the different ordering of activities supported by government? Next in the queue, we had Art Reiser and then Ron Davis.
Yeah, my question also relates to something that Marion said. You know, as maybe one of the only conservatives here, I find one of the most oppressive aspects of the criminal justice regime is the fines and fees aspect. And I mean, it truly is a government program that is run amok and deserves to be drowned in a bathtub. But yet we talk about it, and everybody here has anecdotes about why it's horrible. But what do we actually do about it? And is there any real effort here in Durham or in the state, because this is really going to have to be a state issue, to build right-left coalitions to take this on? Because that's, from my experience, and I work mostly in red states, the only way to is when somebody like Nancy and I just start hammering this through op-eds, through empirical research. Is there something happening here in North Carolina, like we're seeing in Georgia and Texas are doing, and actually Louisiana, funny enough, is actually doing some things on fines and fees through coalitions?
to the other end of the table. Ron Davis?
Yeah, well, question about reconciliation of 3 points. One, what is the follow-up to the racial equity training? I mean, we've developed a lot of training over the years, impartial policing, impartial bias to racial equity. What's the follow-up to make sure it goes from the training classroom to operational? What's the reconciliation between, interestingly, the captain, your community engagement and partnerships, to Scott's community concern about how you fight crime dictates the relationship more so than any individual program. How do these get reconciled? And if it's true that your crime fighting measures are focused on drugs, then how does that align with the new district attorney's priorities in the criminal justice system so that you don't have these colliding ideas or concepts? Because outside of a police department, we know that the operational structure and priorities will set the culture. Everything else is just it's distraction and noise. So how you fight crime, what your priorities have been set, will determine whether or not this is adopted at the rank and file level. So how are you guys reconciling these these norms that most departments are engaged in with your idea of really trying to push the community? You can feel the idea of the community engagement, the co-production of public safety, but how do you get to that true co-production?
Excellent. And Dashika gets the last set of questions. Then we'll see where we are and we'll listen to our folks from Durham.
Awesome. Bringing the conversation back to bail. So one of the major criticism, or two of the major criticism of the current cash bail system is not only does it create a two-tiered wealth-based system, but it also completely ignores the presumption of innocence. So, you know, when we're talking about bail, we're talking about pre-trial. So these people haven't been convicted of a crime yet. And so if there's no scientific evidence to show that bail is used to secure attendance at a hearing or that it reduces recidivism, is there a conversation happening in Durham as far as bringing the presumption of innocence back into the cash bail conversation? And just curious to kind of hear what that is.
So here's the smorgasbord that I'm going to invite people to participate in, our friends from Durham. We had questions about this wonderful starting question. Okay, it's all nice, the stuff that we heard, but what hasn't worked? And I assume you mean what's been tried that hasn't worked. So what have you learned from that failure? That's from Leah, as well as this question of what's the culture of cooperation. You were struck by how maybe they're just on good behavior. They're just getting along well, but what are there fault lines in the reform coalition here? Groups, and then others have asked about something we're struggling with and talking about. Can reform happen absent some sort of process of reconciliation, recognition of harm caused over time? Is that important or not? And is that on the agenda here? And then Marlon sort of moved that conversation, and I'll align him with Nancy's question, which is there an active conversation about a reduction of reliance on current systems, particularly law enforcement, you called it divest from, such that there would be other responses that could be built up, perhaps. Nancy put that more in a budgeting context. Does participatory budgeting take on the issues of where the money goes and how the justice system is supported financially, such that the government structure might take responsibility for realigning resources in ways that might be more effective, recognizing a lot of that is at the state level. And Art says, well, let's start with fines and fees. There's something where we know the system is being supported by the imposition of financial penalties on the back of poor people. And why not start there? Again, recognizing that might be a state system. I was fascinated, parenthetically, by this conversation about judges, in essence, withdrawing from the requirement to acknowledge when you don't impose a fine and notice to the agencies that otherwise would be supported. And that's just bizarre editorial comment, if not obscene editorial comment. But you know, how do you start with the fines and fees where that is a constitutional question, it's a budgeting question, it's a transparency question, and it's a equity question? Is that how far along is that? And then Ron Davis is pulling us back to the racial equity. Really, it's an operational question. How does racial equity training lead to anything besides the awareness among those who are trained? And you put that in the context of police department, but I assume that would apply as well to judges who have been through it. And maybe Judge Trosh can help us with that. But also there was this really interesting question that Ron, wearing his chief hat, really asked the DA as well as the captain here, what do you envision as a new alignment? You raised it as a question. Do we have to prosecute everything that comes in our front door? That's really a question between you and the law enforcement agencies. And how is that an active conversation here as well? And then Dashika brings us back to this fundamental question of presumption of innocence in the bail reform discussion. But that's right at the core of everything we're doing. So there's a smorgasbord. At a smorgasbord, you get to walk up and say, I really want to try that pudding, right? Or I really like this salad over here. So you get to tell me which dish on the smorgasbord you want, and I'll make sure that every dish gets sampled by somebody from Durham. And you get to, am I looking at you, Judge? Were you going to start off?
Looking at me, I'd love to talk about fines.
Well, you had that look like, let me at it. So which dish do you want to take on?
I had that look as a public defender as well.
It's okay. We come here, we all wear many hats.
So I think the fines and fees subject is also a failure. And so I think we can bring some of these together, and it's also the systemic, it's the institutional issues. So I have here a bench card that was created by Jamie Markham at the UNC School of Government. This chart, I'll just go slowly so you can see it. These are all the fees and fines, all the different types. And without getting in the weeds about the history of the legislative changes that Representative Morey talked about, it's a complex maze for judges to navigate.
Open it up. It's not just those 2 pages.
Oh my God.
Well, these are the fines, but this is the explanations. Okay, so it is just this page for the types of fines. But your point is well taken, and that takes me to what we're doing in Durham about it. And is Judge Trosh still there? Yes. Okay. I haven't met Judge Trosh yet, but I've heard a lot about her and what the judges in her jurisdiction did to develop 2 bench cards on fees and fines.
Judge,
So,
can you pass that around?
happy to, sure. So here in Durham, there are two main groups that deal with a lot of the issues that have to do with the justice system, represent different department heads from different agencies, including the Durham Crime Cabinet. And I do lament that we don't have a lot of our local leaders here from City Council or from our county commissioners. But we have the Durham Crime Cabinet and we have the Criminal Justice Advisory Council. And so I've been attending the Crime Cabinet meetings. I did on behalf of the Public Defender's Office for about 10 years. And I continue to go as a judge. And they asked me to chair a committee to look at fines and fees here in Durham in light of legislative changes and this sort of concern, as Judge Hudson said, there isn't one, but the concern from government leaders about what would happen if judges felt constricted about remitting fees and fines. And so we took it upon ourselves to meet. We were in the very beginning. But one thing that I hope, and I can't speak for everyone in Durham, is that we get something that is condensed. Talk to Jamie Markham about a 1-page front and back bench card, because the issue is education and it speaks to the failure. The law has been there. The law has been there about what you have to do under due process before you incarcerate someone for failure to pay money. That was not happening in my early days as a public defender, in the sense that I like to call them the bench hearing, where someone would come to court, they were arrested, which that also needs to stop. It needs to be an order to show cause, not an order for arrest when you fail to pay your money.
I didn't do my hand signals when we began, but I'm going to ask you to wrap
Too
it up.
long. Okay, bottom line is we failed. We haven't been following the procedures. We're hoping to get the procedures loud and clear in black and white in a colloquy for judges and lawyers. I talked to Satana about this a little bit, and hopefully that'll be a big step in the right
I
direction.
think there are a number of people around the table who would like to offer assistance.
Yeah.
Or some perspective or national perspective on some of these issues, because this is active conversation. Let me switch to Marion. Nancy asked you a question about the participatory budgeting exercise, and does that incorporate Marlon's question, but where does the criminal justice dollar go? And does it incorporate or embrace this issue of to what extent are these operations funded by poor people paying fines and fees?
How much time do I have?
I'm sorry?
How much time do I have to speak before you do the?
Oh, 90 seconds. No, go ahead. It could be a yes, no answer, right?
I guess no. I mean, so to the participatory budgeting question, we are still in super early days. Like tomorrow is the first of 2 8-hour trainings to just like learn like how do we actually budget participatorily. But I will say that the amount of money that was allocated to us in the city budget is 2.4 million out of a $644 million budget. So like we are not, you know,
Allocated for distribution through a disability budgeting process.
yes. So we are not
You're
like
not taking on
over the whole
outside.
system. Yeah, we're not. So we can't fix anything that we're talking about right now. But yeah, I'm extremely excited just because the process of choosing who was on the participatory budgeting committee was very thoughtful, and it was with thought to people who have like budget experience. I used to work at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, and so like that's, you know, part of my experience there. People who are just community members and who, you know, like maybe have been advocates on issues like ending cash bail. And so like the idea was to get as many different sorts of people and like people who have like their arms around different parts of the problem in the same room. And so we can all just learn how to do this process together. So I'm really excited. I don't think like this is not in and of itself the revolution, but I think it can be a step towards, you know, sort of dismantling some of the structures that we have in place and some of the funding structures that we have in place.
Marion, I'm going to take that as your answer only in the interest of time. I know, there's a lot more to say. I do want to switch a little bit to the question, which is a version of Marlon's question, Chief Davis's question about the relationship that you envision with the department represented by Captain Addison in terms of the flow of cases and arrest policy as related to prosecutorial policy. Will this change under your once you're in office?
I hope so. You know, so we're working right now on our prosecutorial policy. Like to Marlon's example of, or Scott's example of decriminalization of drug offenses, right? We know that decriminalization of drug offenses works in Durham County because if you go over to Duke and talk to the Duke police chief, he will tell you that the prosecution, that is a low prosecutorial priority for him. And he leaves that to the student justice system and the employee system. So those are the kind of things that we do want to have discussions about. Chief Davis, I think, has been very public about the decriminalization of marijuana in this community, based on who she is and her experience as not just a law enforcement officer, but as a Black person and a member of this community, right? And being the sister of brothers who have been arrested and things like that. And so I think we will certainly have a different relationship with the police department than current district attorneys do. I don't know if you know anything about the history of the district attorney's office in Durham, but it has been troubled at best. And one of our goals is to restore some integrity to that office and create some openness and transparency. And some of that is about having a relationship with DPD and with the sheriff's office where we are on the same page, where we do conduct investigations together, where we do understand, they understand what our priorities are and we understand what their priorities are. Is that a move towards disinvestment in law enforcement? That is a whole bigger conversation. We're also in the middle of a community that is rapidly gentrifying and looking very much different than it has for the last 50 years. And the demands that puts on local elected officials, certainly around the protection of property and the understanding of whose property is important and whose property is not. And so that's a whole lot to unpack that I can't do in 90 seconds.
Hey, Jeremy, I just got to make this one comment. Chief Davis is not related to me, but I've known CJ for about a decade. You guys have a very good chief.
Absolutely.
So if it's going to work, it definitely will work here.
And to talk about the participatory budgeting piece, and Daryl can speak to this because Daryl works in community with folks. We got a brand new police headquarters that was supposed to open up last night. The hurricane stopped that. But there's been a lot of discussion in this community about the amount of money that we put into that police department, as opposed to putting into affordable housing, as opposed to putting into economic development, as opposed to putting into neighborhood revitalization. And, but we also, Chief Davis came for an interview and got stuck in the elevators 3 times in police headquarters. Right. So, everybody in our community deserves safety. We got to think about how we do it, though.
So I want to take on as our last topic before we break, and I'm hoping that we can give a little bit more time to this one. And this is really for the roundtable to be informed about any of you are thinking about the issues of a reckoning that Bruce raised at the outset, and a version of the racial equity training question that this Chief Davis raised. So is that a conversation that's underway within Durham at all about what's the overhang of history? What's the there are all sorts of metaphors that overhang the footprint of the justice system, the harm caused by excessive punishment. Is that something that you want to talk to us about? That is a live conversation that is seen as related to the reform agenda?
Well, I'll sort of hit at it a little bit. Over the last couple of years, our county manager decided to bring in the Racial Equity Institute for training for all of the county employees that wanted to go. He also included the judiciary, public defenders. He included a lot of the state players. And so a lot of us that sit at the governmental seats have been involved in those trainings. I think so, probably more so than any other city in the state. There are a lot of, and I was a part of that. Recently, I was just named, as a matter of fact, I got a email from the mayor this morning. I've been named as the chair of the new Racial Equity Task Force in Durham that is going to be convened. And we will sit together as for a year. And there will be a number of community players that involved in that effort where we're going to probably, I think, address some of those issues.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add to this? Yeah, Scott.
About a year ago, some clients of mine yanked down the Confederate monument in downtown Durham and launched Durham into a national debate around the history of racism in our country. And then recently, some folks yanked it down in Silent Sam, and I'm representing them. And in my conversations with the district attorneys about this, there's been this interesting moment where the prosecutors want to talk about, we just want to focus this in on the elements. This is just about a property crime, and we just want to have a trial about the elements. And I'm like, well, no, actually, I want to have a trial about the hate speech that's represented by this government monument. And I want to litigate the whole history. And I want to bring in a historian and all, I got my witness list. And then one of them today was like, well, we'll stipulate to that it's a Confederate monument and that it means, I'm like, okay, that sounds good, because will you also stipulate that that had to do with slavery and that it has to do with race and white supremacy? How far are we going to go on this? And suddenly there was this, well, hold on now, I don't know if we can go stipulate to all that. And I'm like, here we are in this day and age. And the state of North Carolina is afraid to stipulate to what the meaning of a Confederate monument is. And so in our courts and in our city and in our fabric of our being, we are still wrestling with that as we speak. And our courts happen to be a place where we're litigating that at this time.
Can I speak real quickly to the cohesion question that you asked? So this is Durham County, it's a Democratic county. We are not all the same kind of Democrat, though.
And we got some communist Democrats.
we got
revolutionary Democrats.
Or I guess you would say, folks would say we are progressive, but we're not all the same kind of progressive. Some of us are more progressive, some of us are conservative progressives, some of us are whatever. And there, I am sitting here now, and kind of people are genuflecting to me, but there are a lot of people in this community who did not support what I said. Right, did not support what I ran on, and we're very vocal about it. So to say that we have uniformity in how we are moving forward is only because you've asked the right questions in this roundtable. On the ground, I think there will be different outcomes and different conversations that we will have. And, but what we all are is committed to Durham, right? And I think we all have a vision of how we want our, I said this a lot during the campaign. You will forgive me if you have heard it before, but I am the Black mother of Black children in this community. And so it is very important to me that the least among us in this community have the opportunity to thrive. And I think that is true for all of us.
Well, on behalf of the Square One Roundtable, I want to thank all of you for your contributions to our thinking and our understanding and our general level of knowledge about what you're doing, but really so impressive the topics you're tackling, the journey you're on, doing for people who will follow and watch with interest. And as we're turn it over to Daryl to wind up, but there's people here who would be eager to work with you, support you, connect you with others who may be doing similar work. Looking at John Troy, we're both on the executive session on the role of prosecutor, the Institute of Innovation and Prosecution, and you are not alone. There are lots of interesting people around the country, newly elected prosecutors wrestling with very similar issues. But we just wish you every success, and we'll watch with interest as you do the work of reimagining justice. Thank you.
No, I want to thank everyone for giving up their time. I know we got plenty of other important stuff to do. And I also want to own that we probably ran out of time, and the intellectual tension in the room was rising, and we hate to truncate the conversation and blame it on your moderator if we didn't have enough time to explore all of these issues. And we're here, and this conversation doesn't have to end. And so I'm legally trained, but I'm also trained as an organizer, and any organizer worth his salt is going to make an ask. And so my ask to the Durhamites is that we continue to convene this multi-stakeholder body to continue to plan on operationalizing Square One. We have a litany of resources around the table that we can avail ourselves to continue down this path. So I guess what I'm asking for is a commitment to do that. Everybody on board? Awesome.
Congratulations to all of you. Thank you so much. We'll take a 15-minute break. Welcome to stay.
I want to thank Sam. I'm the manager for the Roundtable. I just wanted to really quickly pull attention to Carmen Wilder. He's a paper writer. He was the winner of our paper. He's all over.
He's here.
He's here. Carmen, stand up. He has this analysis, this psychosocial analysis of criminal justice. And I just wanted to acknowledge his presence here. I think he absorbed a lot, and I also wanted to present this to him. I want to back off of Barrett saying I want to continue this conversation on the by camera, and all of you tonight are mostly heard Kerry talk over at the Durham Arts Center. It starts at 6:30. We ask you to pick up one of these because there is an RSVP link. Tell your friends, tell your people, tell them to come out. 6:30 to 7:30. It will just be casual. We'll have something to grease the wheels for conversation there. So please come out. 7:30 is the actual talk that Marlon is going to lead and kind of interview Melissa Perez. It's going to be quite the night. Kevin, we hope you will come. Would you like to say anything to this body?
Yes,
please.
Well, first off, thank you so much for the recognition. I should probably, I guess, preface this by saying that I am not a professional by any stretch. My closest relationship, I guess, to justice would be I have some work in publications in forensic psychology, so I like to look at how mental health disorders and people that are affected by them are treated by the justice system, kind of similar to how you all look at how different races and people from different communities are affected by different laws and how that can be changed to better suit those people. And I guess my whole reason for just contributing to this is because I kind of wanted to be a part of the discussion, and I think that something that you guys kind of talked about with being solution-oriented and kind of implementing a multidisciplinary attack issues that are complex as this. And so I think that it's really awesome that big leaders in fields such as yours are kind of coming together and meeting things like this. And I hope that this helps you continue, and that's something I can be part of.
Thank you, Cameron. In 15 minutes. That includes, let's see, who can I call out? Let's go for the dean. Dean O'Neill, you can find your way.
I actually want to make one of those falls.
Thank you. And Bruce Western is on his way back.
Best of luck in Durham.
Bobby Brown.
That was mine, sorry.
Oh,
I was not-
Monica Bell.
A little sleepy.
Hello.
Go take a comfort, but I'm
Hey, Bobby.
sometimes you just.
That did it.
It's a lot.
Okay.
2 straight days of this.
Judge Trosh. Amika.
Oh, yeah, space.
Break it up.
All right. All right.
Okay.
Wow. Got a mutiny going on.
Whoa. Serious stuff happening. So Judge Trosh, you can actually tap her on the shoulder. You can either take it out down the hall or come back. We'd rather she come back. Okay. This is the time that we have provided for observers to make some observations about what we've been talking about in the form of a suggestion of something that we should consider that we haven't yet considered. Could be in the form of a question, but we won't answer it right now. We'll just put it into our conversation. The challenge today at this moment is to be concise. If you have things that you'd like to say. And just so we continue to get to know each other, your name and affiliation, if you would. So who would like to make sure that we think about something we haven't thought about yet? Who's in the outer ring? Yes, and just stand up and remind us who you are and your affiliation.
Very quickly, Pamela Kimbrough. My affiliation is Lincoln University of Pennsylvania, the first HBCU. Sorry about that. But I just wanted to say, I appreciate everybody in the room, but my observation was who may not be in the room. And one of the things is that I wear a number of hats, and I appreciate Dean O'Neill and Bobby Brown sharing their experiences. But one of the experiences, or one of the hats that I also wear, is a mother who has lost a son to violence. And I think that we can't reimagine justice without including those individuals who have been harmed. And the question was, who's been harmed? And also, when I think about prosecutors and you look at the state versus. And so we have the states stepping in as proxies for those individuals who've been harmed. And when we reimagine justice, I think it's important that we make sure that we hear from those individuals who have been impacted. Not just directly by the criminal justice system, but also by impacted by harm. So that's what I would like to.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Duly noted, and something we've discussed in planning the rollout of the roundtable over time. Who else would like to make a note? Yeah, and please say who you are.
My name is Leah Sakala, and I work at the Restorative Justice Policy Center. And I just wanted to follow up on the robust discussion from this morning about what an explicit racial justice strategy might look like as we think about reimagining justice, and really offer the juvenile justice system experience over the past decade or two as an important case study in what it might look like if a lot of progress is made, for example, in the juvenile justice space. About the importance of trauma. There's a lot less political will behind the idea of sending lots of kids far away from their families, taking them out of communities, and increasing recognition of the harm. But even as those numbers of kids who've been locked in detention and also post-adjudication detention have gone down, the racial disparities have increased a lot. And so I think as we think about what the system might look like broadly, including for adults, that's just a really important example to keep in our minds as the potential consequence of not being really explicit with both those cultural implications of implicit bias and language, as well as the structural.
Right. Thank you, Leah. We'll hear more from you tomorrow. So it's good to hear your voice today. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Philip Durham, RTI International. I direct our Center on Social Determinants, Risk Behaviors, and Prevention Science. We've been talking about system response to the folks who are actually in the juvenile justice system, in the criminal justice system. What we haven't really talked about are those upstream factors that really prevent us from having these conversations. And I realize that this is through a justice lens. I do wonder, someone's talked about really this being comprehensive with multiple systems as a part of the solution. And if we can also think about how does the criminal justice system interact with all those other pieces that prevents us even having these conditions where young people are committing themselves to, although retired, Judge O'Neill's court and the like. What do we need to really do? Because at the end of the day, those folks who are committing these offenses don't do that because that's how they were born, right? And so there are a set of social circumstances, structural impediments that lead to that. How can this system and those folks who work in that space work with those other systems to even prevent that? So we reduce the number of folks even coming in contact with the system as a part of this, how we reimagine not only justice, but well before we even get to this point and having to deal with these issues.
Another 3 great observations. Somebody over, yes, you,
I had a couple of observations, one stemming from the response.
and you are just so
Oh,
you're.
I'm sorry. And this morning, Jordan, posed the question. One of the responses that I heard was that youth need to organize more. And I just wanted to respectfully disagree with that simply because in my work with youth in Mecklenburg County, when I was the criminal justice planning manager there, when I got linked to the right people, they were able to bring lots of young people to the table. They were extremely organized throughout Charlotte area, pockets of very organized young people, but they lacked access to information. And so I recognized my role in government at that time. I was a gatekeeper to data and information. And once we got together and they access in real time what's going on with the communities, not only they can call the police, asking the police to come into their communities, but in North Carolina, they can go to the magistrate's office and seek a warrant. So why are our community members going to the magistrate's office and seeking a warrant? So once we sat down with that data and had conversations, there were several epiphanies as to, well, maybe we could do this within our community, with our churches, with our nonprofits, rather than the government coming in and inserting themselves. We've got the resources to solve some of these problems. So I really think that as stakeholders, and we're all gatekeepers in our systems, that's something that we're really gonna have to challenge people as we reimagine, is that everyone has a role as a gatekeeper. The other piece that I wanted to speak to was the power flip. So the goal through that whole effort was to move power from law enforcement to the community. And I would say that through that experience, I witnessed for myself and for others that is not only healing for people of color to get that power back, but healing for white people to let it go. Because we're never intended to have this level of power. Obviously, we've never been able to feel this. And so I think that when we talk about healing, which I think Daryl mentioned this morning, it's really important to think about, even as systems reform, there's going to be healing built into that for both parties.
Great, thank you. Great. Any other comments, questions from the observers who are here? Seeing none. Okay. As I said, we're in the home stretch, and that means that there's a very good possibility that some of our members might leave before the end of the session. One of them is Daryl, and because we're talking about reimagining justice, I'd ask you to take 90 seconds or so to tell people why you have to leave early, where you're going.
Well, Arthur and I.
Arthur too, I'm sorry.
We're not going to talk about my circuitous route and his direct route, but anyway, we're going to.
I think you identified it earlier.
Yeah, more than white privilege, right? we were fortunate enough to be part of a delegation that'll be going to Germany and Norway to meet with some of the criminal justice practitioners and visit some prisons there, because they do things radically different. This will be my second experiential learning opportunity. The first one, I went to Portugal, and Portugal decriminalized drugs and all drugs in 2001. And it was a really amazing experience to be able to go and see something different, to be able to imagine something different.
On that theme, Arthur, you want to just your anticipation of what you'll see?
Everybody that I've known that's gone on this trip, which includes yourself and John Malcolm, who's one of the most conservative human beings that I've ever met, has said that it was life-changing, that they walked away with a new, not only new ideas, but a new way of perceiving the world, which I'm looking forward to.
sometimes reimagining justice isn't just in the mind, it really is seeing other things, other cultures, countries, jurisdictions, people that just allow us to say what's possible. Susan and I had a great discussion over lunch today about her interest and a shared interest I have about in Northern Ireland. Police reform in Northern Ireland under a concept of human dignity is a sight to behold. It's just quite remarkable. Came out of a conflict, right? And going to Germany, I've done this myself, but you really reflect on the experience of the Holocaust and providing a different framing for a legal structure in Germany that oversees their prisons under a constitutional provision judicially enforced of human dignity. The first article of their constitution is the state must respect human dignity of all people, and that's enforced by the federal courts. Prisons are very different for that reason. Brian Stevenson talks a lot about the importance of what the Germans have done to recognize, name, talk about the harms caused out of the Holocaust, and likewise South Africa. So just to have a frame, as you will have, for not just how does the system operate differently, but how did the society get there, and recognize that that's possible for us as well as. I know you'll both bring that back to the executive session. Dashika, do you have to leave early also? Is that possible? So we might lose you. But we want to thank both of you. If you do have to leave, I just thank you in advance. Feel free to just slip out
after the session,
without any fanfare. But we just are really grateful for your contributions. So here we are in the home stretch for the day, and the title of our next segment, we're a little behind schedule, is Politics, Race, and Crime. Kerry in some ways gave a preview for his paper yesterday, but we want to give him his full, of course, 10 minutes today to talk about the way he has framed these issues in it with a criminal justice lens, which is very informative. And then we'll open up the conversation and see how we can start to integrate some of our themes around this big question of politics and power. Kerry.
Thank you. Let me apologize in advance. I also have to leave, going to South Africa. I have with students in the morning. We're leaving campus at 4:30, so I have to miss the tomorrow session. So I apologize in advance. Let me thank again Daryl for the previous session and making sure that was part of the lineup, and it set up perfectly what it is I'm going to talk about. And in fact, that's my conclusion. What we just saw is the conclusion of at least what I was attempting to do in this paper. And that is reimagining a different type of policy making and political decision making. And that there's the potential for this to happen, given some change in dynamics in this country. One of the things that Donald Trump says that he's right about, when he says, and he says it often, that the Democrats should not have lost 2016, presidential race in 2016, they should not have lost. He's correct when he says that. There have been some electoral dynamics over the past couple of decades that if you look at the electoral map, the electoral college map, it should be very difficult for Republicans to win at the presidential level. Take, for example, President Obama. When he won in 2008, he won in states like Colorado, Iowa, New Mexico, Virginia, Ohio. When he won in North Carolina, it was the first time that a Democrat had won since Jimmy Carter. He won in Virginia, also another southern state that the Democrats hadn't won in many election cycles. Obama won without winning a state in the Deep South. There's a path to victory for the Democrats at the national level that doesn't involve the South at all. You can win the presidency for Democrats without winning any southern states, including Florida, North Carolina, and Virginia. Obama won all of those in 2008. Had he lost those three, he still would have beat McCain by 50-55 electoral college votes. One of the changes that's happened over the past 2 decades has been the change in demographics. If we look beneath the national level, as I talk about in the paper, at the state level, this is extremely important in certain states. The ones I mentioned, Colorado, Iowa, New Mexico, Virginia, Ohio, are now on the table for Democratic victories. And Obama demonstrated that with his election in 2008, that you can win in those states. One of the reasons that those states have become competitive for Democrats, and now in a couple of those cases, safe Democratic states, it might appear, is the change in populations of those states, particularly the increasing Latino population. And as you see in the paper, I talk about these state populations. And there are 20 states in which if you combine the Black and Latino population, there are 20 states in which the combined population of Blacks and Latinos make up between 25 and 52% of the state's total population. 20 states in which the combined Black and Latino population between 25 and 52%. These states have a combined 312 electoral college votes, 42 more than necessary to win the presidency. And they have the potential to significantly change politics as we know it. These states also, as you know, 40 US Senate seats. There are 272 US House of Representative seats, 2,956 state legislative seats. And I didn't even compute what we saw here, the number of city council, county commission, judgeships, DA, school board seats in these states in which the Black and brown population is increasing and has the potential to be a dominant force in politics and lead to outcomes like what we saw and what we see in Durham. I think the DA mentioned, Durham has a 100-year history of Black political influence, significant influence. That's only increased over time due to some of the dynamics, not unlike what I described in the paper. So one main point is that we see the potential to have a different set of policymakers and a different policy agenda if this potential electoral power can be brought to bear. Now, there are some impediments to this potential power that are out there, and there's some well-known impediments that folks in this room have stood. I see Professor Joyner, when you talk about the gerrymandering, racial and partisan gerrymandering, right, has been used as an attempt to dilute the Black vote and disenfranchise Black voters. Much studied. Voter ID laws are now in fashion as an attempt to limit the power of the Black and brown vote. The argument I make in the paper is that we should pay more attention to mass incarceration and felony disenfranchisement. This is talked about quite a bit. It's not a new call. It's out there. But what I attempted to do in the paper was to put some concrete examples and draw some direct consequences of this potential impediment, not a potential, it's a real impediment to Black and brown political power. It's another tool to limit the Black and brown vote. Exercise I do with my students in class is I had a state politics class, and I had the students to go and do research. I assigned them each a state, 26 students in the class, and to look up voter ID laws in their assigned state. And I asked them when it was placed on the legislative agenda and first debated, who introduced it, which party introduced it. Now a significant percentage of these came after the election of Barack Hussein Obama to the White House, where all of a sudden it became fashionable and concerned that the integrity of the electoral process. Why not in 2004, 2096? And nothing changed in terms of evidence of problems with the process other than Obama being elected. The Republicans undertook what they call an autopsy after losing in 2012. And one of the outcomes of that was the recognition that they had to be more competitive with these Black and brown voters if they were going to win at the presidential level. So they saw and understood and recognized this demographic change leading to political changes. Now, I would submit that rather than going full force and trying to recruit Black and brown supporters to the party, that they doubled down on the things that we've seen in the past with voter ID, trying to limit the rights of folks to vote and the opportunity of folks to participate in the process. I don't think it's a coincidence that mass incarceration and felony disenfranchisement is the issue that it is. If you look, as I mentioned in the paper, at the states that have the highest proportion of their population incarcerated, particularly Black and brown population, it's these same states where you see the greatest potential for political power, right? So these states where you see the demographics changing and there's potential for Black and brown folks to have influence in the political process unlike ever before. Those are the states that also have the greatest percentage of Black and brown folks in prison and disenfranchised. Coincidental? Perhaps. I don't think so. So just to conclude with a couple of other points that I wanted to make in the paper, that perhaps we're looking for change in some of the wrong places. Most of our attention's on national level politics. The levels of government that are most consequential for how we live are subnational, on how we live on a day-to-day basis, decisions made by at state capitals, state legislatures, and local ordinances and decisions made at the local level. Most of the attention in this regard is on national level politics. And I'm going to draw some attention to the importance of looking at the subnational level. Another point to be raised in this analysis is that, leave felon disenfranchisement aside. If we mobilize the Black and brown voters who are not connected to the criminal justice system, that potential power will be more than potential. One of the lessons of 2016 is that Hillary Clinton didn't mobilize and turn out the voters who might have been natural supporters, had she asked. In this state, I remember an NPR reporter was here and I was going to interview and I said to her, and in my barbershop down the street here, Friendly City, that there was not one sign, this was in October, not one sign of Hillary Clinton in the barbershop. And I compared that to 2008 and 2012, that the whole damn wall had Obama. And so she said, why is that? I said, I don't know. But there was a lack of presence. My point was a lack of presence in this county in general. And so she had me call the barber and ask. He said, no one asked me. He said, the Obama people brought this stuff in every week, sometimes twice a week, bringing me leaflets. No one from the Clinton campaign ever asked. So this potential power is there if it's mobilized. And I think given the topic, it's about reimagining justice. We talked about some of the same folk who are often the victims of the injustices. And this potential to involve folks and get folks involved in the process, mobilize these folks to become voters, has the potential to change politics and public policy as we know it in areas like criminal justice, health, education, and social welfare. And the example of what we just saw going on in Durham, this is because these are folks who have been elected by the citizens of Durham. And they know that we have their back, right? That there's a coalition that has their back. You can have the chief judge sit here and say some of the things that he said and not feel threatened electorally. And he's right, that there'll be an ad on about these judges, but there's a coalition in Durham of voters where these folks have we have their back and they have support from a coalition of voters, and that makes a difference. I'll leave with close with one question that we tossed around a lot, particularly this morning. And that is, we can't assume, and it's not a given, that electing more Black and brown folk to elected positions will necessarily and automatically end up in the kinds of policies that the folks in the earlier panel were discussing. It's not a given. And so I always ask my students, can you expect different outcomes by simply changing the players of a game if you keep the same rules of the game? So same rules, different players, can we expect outcome? And that's a larger question for us to consider as we go along. And I'll start with that.
Excellent. Thank you, Kerry. So there's a nice linkage actually in these three papers in terms of participation in civic life, and to what extent does that create a possibility for change? To use Monica's framing of it, it's not the agency. Well, what's my new word here? Agentic,
I guess.
the agentic power of community. Does the community have agentic power that can be expressed politically or can be expressed in lots of other ways? So anyone who wants to help us draw the threads through the morning and the afternoon and to weave Durham into our discussion, that's a facilitator's gold star. So I'm just asking you and you, if you're seeing threads that make sense, to make sure that we see them as well. So with that hope and expectation, the floor is open.
I'll have to leave as well this
good.
evening, so I will be with everyone tomorrow.
I didn't mean to say, oh, good, you have to leave, but I'm glad that you're going to say something.
I know exactly what you meant, Jeremy.
I always like
talk to you about that later. Throughout the whole morning and this afternoon, I am compelled by a couple of things that I think continue to be deeply frustrating for me as an organizer at the local, state, and federal level. And I call it the powerlessness of the powerful. You talk to people who are executives at the local, state, and federal level, and I've heard so many times that my hands are tied and I can't do anything. Whether I'm sitting in the White House, never with Ron. Ron never told me that. At the state level, at the local level, it continues to, my dear brother Art mentioned this when you were talking about Jared, asking, can you help me get the Attorney General? It's like your guy's the president. Like, so it seems to me either people who are powerful politically situated in the system do not know how to wield their power on behalf of the oppressed, or they're just not interested in doing so in a way that risks their proximity or access to power. Now, depending on who you ask from the movement space, everybody will have a very strong opinion about people's intentions and et cetera, et cetera. What I would like to just lift up is, if we are talking about reimagining justice, I think we need to attend to this kind of dilemma of the balance of powers in the way bureaucracy limits powerful people from making broad decisions that will help stand this up, or the lack of political courage powerful leaders have in being able to accelerate these truths and principles when they are elected or appointed or serve in these roles. And the great impact of that to me is when, again, in Ferguson, Baltimore, Oakland, Baton Rouge, none of those were Trump Republicans that had control of the local government, quote unquote, right? They were all Democrats. They were all progressives. They all would claim to be the champions of poor people and Black people. And yet, when Black folks turned out in the streets, they unleashed the militarized police force on all of our heads. And or when you go into the daily jail systems, to the district attorney's point earlier, and the whole system is led by Black folks, and yet we get the exact same outcomes. I just think we have to continue to ask a different kind of question about power, about governance, and about how we are negotiating that part of the conversation in this circle.
So Mike, just help us with your answer to your question, particularly from your experience as a community organizer. How does that answer help us think about what is possible in the reimagining justice space? I was also struck, as I gather you were, maybe others were, by the observation about Durham as having a long history of Blacks in power and a reformist mood right now, because that I think is supporting. That's not enough. So in your experience, what moves the powerful who are powerless, seen from a community organizing point of view, or any other perspective that you think we should hold on to as we think about the reimagining justice imperative?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if they are elected, the threat of them losing their election would move folks, but then we wrestle with the limit that Dr. Kerry just raised, that they're systematically trying to limit our access to the ballot. The interruption of capital historically has been, you think of Operation Breadbasket and the things that, King and Jesse Jackson and all these folks were doing all across the country right before the assassination of Dr. King. The interruption of capital seems to help people grow a brain about, equal access. But I do think what is most limiting, if I take imagination seriously, is people who are participating in the systems broadly have not seen another system work at scale. And so I think there is this sense of would it look like, I would put a proposal on the table, something we're going to be trying to work on, to find cities on a hill across the country that we can create. Smaller cities, rural cities, where the politics may not be as much of a barrier to scale up all of these aspirations, where folks can actually see that you can cut a police budget by 30% and directly reinvest that into certain parts of the underfunded innovations that are happening. And it won't make crime go through the roof. It won't turn the whole city council upside down. The politics won't blow up. What would it look like for us, I think, to spend more time creating wholesale, citywide expressions of something different so people's imaginations can be catalyzed? Again, many of the police chiefs that we work with who love the innovations around gun violence reduction strategies. The police chiefs who move to other cities after working in a city that does those innovations are much easier to work with because they've seen it done. And it's like, I don't have to go in here and convince you. I've did procedural justice in my former city. I've sat with street outreach workers. I've seen that this actually makes police officers' lives safer. And so if we create cities on the hill, we can create a pipeline of legislators, of executives that can help recreate and replicate that maybe to scale in other places.
Leah, you're
Sure.
just enjoying the conversation, please.
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to hold them for right now and say I don't think you can answer Pastor Mike's question without tackling Kerry's concept of this new, to borrow a phrase, this new majority, right? Or this potential new majority. And I was struck by something you said, Kerry, when you were talking about, I think you said in your bar, you said nobody has asked me. I don't know because no one's asked me. I actually worked at a project during the summer of 2016, doing exactly that, going around and asking focus groups about, why don't you have the same level of enthusiasm that you had in 2008 or even 2012 when there were, drop-offs in enthusiasm amongst Black millennials. And so many of them pointed back to exactly what Pastor Mike said. In fact, almost all of them pointed back to that. So it wasn't simply about, people coming into my neighborhood, nobody has reached out to me, da, 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 da. But there was a real anger, and I know some of us talked about this during the break, there was a real anger that I don't necessarily know that we are recognizing on an institutional level with voters, Black and brown voters, about how they feel they have been shorted by the system. And until we begin to even address that, right? So in addressing it, not just in terms of voter suppression, gerrymandering, voter ID laws, mass incarceration, but also addressing these people who have been left out or left behind in a system that by all outward appearances have these markers of progress, right? Hey, Black unemployment, right? Record lows. Why are people still angry? Why are they still dissatisfied with the political process? I mean, I interviewed one person from Ferguson, a young woman in her mid-20s who had been on the ground the day Mike Brown died. And she said, I expected all these leaders that I had, I'd been a Democrat my entire life and da, 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 da. All these people I helped elect, cast my first ballot. My parents said, we're Democrats. That's what we do. This is what we do. I expected them to stand up and say something. And they said nothing.
Or the wrong thing.
Right, or the wrong thing. This young woman in particular was furious that she said the first person who stood up was Rand Paul. And she said, I've been told my whole life. And so I said, does this mean you're going to go out and support Rand Paul? She was like, no, this doesn't mean I'm going to. She said, it probably means that I'm either going to be asking really hard questions of these people who have expected my vote and my support, or I'm not going to vote. And that was, I think, something that you can only tap into by actually going out and interviewing and talking to people who are considered unlikely voters, non-voters, right? Groups that traditionally have been left behind. The other thing that I will say is that there was a level of anger that we also saw from Latino communities in the build-up to the 2016 election that was not addressed. And so part of, I think, too, what we've been dancing around is this idea of what do we have to do internally within these coalitions that we have built that we assume have our best interests in mind? What are we doing within those groups to hold them accountable and say, it's not enough that the other side is bad, right? That you're the lesser of two evils. That's not going to work anymore. What are you going to do for us? And then how do you make that happen? And I think this is a real dilemma.
Just a clarifying question for you. Is the anger that you're describing a change in a level of anger over time from 2012 to 2016 when you did your focus groups? Like, was that a more acute anger, or it's always been anger and that we haven't addressed it?
So I think there's definitely, and it's almost a difficult anger to tease out because it coexists with warmth, partisan warmth towards particular ideas and parties. So on the one hand, you would get people who would say, I love Barack Obama. I have a shrine to him in my living room, and everything that he's ever given me in life, congratulations on your wedding, is framed.
Right.
At the same time, I am very angry at the party because I haven't seen the types of things that they promised me that I would get. And so, whether that be at the state, the local, the municipal, whatever level. And so trying to reconcile those things, and also noticing that the drop off, so the statistical drop off starts in roughly 2012, and Gen Forward surveys has wonderful data on this. But actually, we see it much earlier. We see it with kind of the explosion of, say, Occupy Wall Street, right, in the kind of rebirth of the labor movement and this push. But we really see it in Black Lives Matter. And the explosion that happens in Black Lives Matter, that should have been a sign that something was deeply off.
Thanks. I think one of the questions for us as we think about the reimagination opportunity, whether is there an anger that can be tapped for change about the current state of mass incarceration that would be analogous to the Black Lives Matter anger, if we want to call it that, about the system, the way the system works? And if so, how might that be channeled in ways that would produce real change, whatever real change looks like. And of course, the question that we always come back to is what are the obstacles and how deeply entrenched is the power structure? So that, is this a fool's errand? Are we just thinking that this might be possible where it's not? And just back to Pastor Mike's hopeful observation is by actually thinking about and testing some ideas of things that might be quite different, is that enough to over time build a demand for something quite different? And what does that demand look like? And what does that demand ask for from a power structure that's not likely to give into, who had Frederick Douglass in the room here, without a demand? So what does that demand look like for something quite different than around the edges if we don't tinker, right? Around the edges that's simple and that's easy. We can feel good about it. But we're talking about very deep changes in the way we respond to crime and operate the justice system, where there's lots of entrenched interest. Not to be a downer at the end of the day, but can we imagine that? Oh, lots of tense women. Okay. Kerry, I'm going to ask you to wait a little bit, and I don't know if doesn't matter. John, you'll go first, and Michael Finley, and then we'll come back to Kerry. Okay.
Well, I think this is a really critical conversation, because if we ever want to change the things that we really desperately want to see differently to be ultimately sustained, and it's beyond a particular individual and person, I think that we have to be really strategic about all of these things. And I think there's lessons to be learned right now, because I think right now in this moment in time, we are in some massive change. I'm feeling it as the chief prosecutor as it relates to criminal justice reform, but it was done throughout this country in a very strategic way, and it still is today. And so now we even have groups who are infusing money into the electoral process. But remember now, criminal justice reform actually started in the South, in many of the communities where they were over incarcerating people to just by leaps and bounds. I come from a very low incarceration state, but there are many states that have clearly over incarcerated. And so those states are controlled by conservative Republicans. But people figured out, and I think the work that you've been doing and also Right on Crime, to engage the people that were people who are in power, talks about some of the things that they care about. So what the conservatives in the South didn't like was that they were spending massive amounts of money and they weren't getting the return. They were convinced that the return coming back with respect to public safety, right, wasn't yielding that investment. And so you saw a number of things happen in some southern states, and now you've got justice reinvestment happening. You've got prosecutors who are very, very much invisible. But now today they're not. I mean, they have to be thinking about, especially if you're in an urban jurisdiction, you have to be thinking about kind of what your community is wanting you to do. And I think some of the frustration that might exist from advocates is, I think, and there is a sense of urgency. There really is. I mean, there has to be amongst all of us and people in power. But I think the hesitation sometimes is that when you're in the seat of governing and you've got responsibilities from an ethical standpoint, from making sure that whatever is happening, it's legitimate in the eyes of all, not just the people with the loudest voices, but all people, that it's legitimate. And that's where the opportunities are. And so I think as we think about how to build that, we can't just speak to the choir and just talk to ourselves, but we have to think about how do we convince other people to recognize that it's in their interest to redefine public safety, to say that if we continue this path of incarcerating people, and we're not thinking about who really should be incarcerated and who doesn't need to be incarcerated, we're actually diminishing public safety. We're making everybody less safe. We're doing more harm by caging people who don't need to be there. And so those types of messages, as they're being developed and kind of trickled into the political environment, I actually see it kind of working. But I think we just need to continue to be really thoughtful, strategic, thinking about who ultimately has that power, and really thinking about how to craft those messages. Because right now, the way I see it is that criminal justice reform is a bipartisan issue. It's not a left-right thing at all. In fact, I know many, many conservatives who have very much believe that we need to change our current paradigms. And also too, for the people in power, in order for us to have legitimacy in the eyes of the people who would actually do the work, and to have legitimacy in the people who aren't thinking about these issues, we have to be really thoughtful about how we go about this particular change. And so I, as somebody who is the chief prosecutor in my community, I'm actually really grateful that we're having this more attention paid to some of these justice reform issues, because when I came in as an elected official back in 2010, I actually ran on the justice reform agenda, but nobody was really thinking about it or talking about it. So I was back then talking about treatment courts, diversion, but that today, that's a standard stuff that we're doing today. And as we're expanding, and I think a part of this too is that I also have come to the conclusion, because we've done some great things around juvenile detentions alternatives initiatives. I mean, we used to have over 100 kids locked up waiting resolution of their case. Today, we had one day this year, we had 13 kids in detention. But the disparities have gotten worse.
Yeah.
And I still see the issues, the underlying issues that we're just nibbling at the edges, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I think this whole Square One project is so critical, to think about everything that we've kind of baked into our psyche and our cultures and our systems, to say that we need to do something different.
So at some point, I'd like to invite you and Judge Trosh back into the conversation, just to talk to us as politicians, you know, as you run for office. What's it like? I mean, the democracy, our democracy can be a great driver of change, and I think that's what John is alluding to. Is that's why I'm fascinated by these progressive prosecutors. That nice little discussion with Satana here. But what's the platform? What are you accountable for when you run for re-election? And what risks are you willing to take in the public eye? And Elizabeth, you didn't, we talked about it a little bit, but we didn't push you on it before, but I'm just fascinated by how much you're doing so publicly, so differently, reflecting your deep understanding of the structural problems of our justice system. So I want to come back to that as a political question. But Michael Finley is going to help us first with whatever you would like to add to.
You said help. I didn't commit to that. No, I think I'm a little low on brain power, so I'm a little unclear with what question we're trying to answer.
I just nominated for later discussion whenever I feel it's right. What's it like to run for office on it?
Oh no, I wasn't referring to that. I was saying big picture of this discussion. So because these are conversations that are somewhat. There's a mix, right? There's sort of they're academic in way sort of theory, and then there's sort of practice, right? So there's my own introspection saying, okay, I'm sort of hearing, and I get everything that's being said. I think so I'm thinking now of Square One, and sometimes you've asked sort of Square One, what could we be doing, right? And I think part of this is at some point there will have to be defining what the it is. And I think trying to be thoughtful about that, because when you have a room of a lot of people, really smart people in the room, the it can sometimes become, well, we don't want to change public policy for everything for poor people and people of color in the country, and that's huge. And I'm not saying that that's not what we should do, but it's how do you do that in a structured, organized way? So that's my own personal, but I'm trying to work through. And I think, so when we're thinking about reimagining justice, because other things I said, I wasn't trying to respond directly to that, but I think yesterday when Marlon brought up abolition, and then the divestment piece today, Vivian talking about, we need to be thinking about these systems, like these systems are screwed up. Right, and I think you also, like several people said it. So to me, when we really think of reimagining, part of this is really, and I was, again, I talked just about the boxes and some electoral stuff that for me I struggle with, that this should look totally different, that this should be an opportunity to really rethink this stuff in a way that isn't based in the current structure. Like there's a thing that's gonna work, like if you're in court and there's kids going through and everybody knows, you could say, you read the fact pattern, and everybody in the room knows that we know what's gonna happen to that kid. They're gonna get this, and they're gonna bomb out of this in 2 weeks. Everybody in the room knows, has agreed, this will be the future of this child in this program. We know what's gonna happen, and we let it happen, right? So we're not being thinking adults. And I think as we sit here, what my struggle is, we're saying, right, these systems, we're all agreeing, weren't meant for us, are designed to be screwy and messed up. Yet we're gonna try to figure, and this is part of our own work, like we struggle with harm reduction versus really going all the way to a different space. So I think trying to figure out this continuum that today, right, the work will be harm reduction, trying to figure it out, but this is an opportunity to really rethink and experiment. So when we say, hey, in Durham, there's some things going on, whether you think about looking at particular places and really uplifting those examples. So everybody in this field knows of these things happening and how to sort of do that.
Harry, you still want to make?
Yeah, just a
now,
second.
and then Art, and then I do, yeah, Monica, and then I do want to ask John and Elizabeth to talk a little bit about the politics of reform.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I think in terms of the reimagining, I think in the square one piece, is education. We talked a lot about this throughout the last couple of days, and particularly civic education. Some of that anger, right? I've looked at some focus group data and survey data that folks are angry and upset, but it's often misplaced, right? They have expectations of one level of elected official, and the person has no authority to act on the issue that they're concerned about. And folks just don't know the system. When you answer the question about your electoral experience, I'd like to know how many votes you got out of how many were cast, because we dropped down off of, I mean, we all know, right? You vote for governor, and then those other offices drop off. You vote for president, then those other offices drop off. In the midterms coming up, right, at the top of the ticket, there'll be big turnout numbers. For the judges, nobody votes. Folks just don't know. I have a hard time. I have to get the ballot and study the ballot, and this is what I do as a living, right, to figure out the ballot. And so civic education is a piece about square one, going back to educating folks about this system. That potential power is not going to ever be realized if folks don't know how to then put that power to use.
We're going to ask Art to make his observation, John and Elizabeth to talk a bit about politics. I'll make a closing metaphor. Bruce will help us understand where we've been over a long day. I can't wait where we've been. Then we'll ask Suki to tell us a bit about the celebration tonight. And Judge O'Deal would like to get in there on politics or this other.
This is my last day, so I just have some.
Okay, great. Okay.
Shameless plug, I wrote an article in The Guardian called The Conservative Case for Criminal Justice Reform. So you can read all these next things I'm going to say there in full detail. And I want to echo a little bit what Kerry was talking about at the beginning, but on the other side, because this is something that is right in the face. And also you mentioned about right on crime in Texas, that, you know, Trump gained about 8% of the black vote. Reagan got about 9% of the black vote. Trump got about 28% of the Hispanic vote, and Reagan got 35% of the Hispanic vote. Now, while black population has not really risen in the United States, the Hispanic population, in 1980 was 6.5%. Today it's 17%, and by 2050 it's going to be 33%. And if you don't think that the center right is thinking about these numbers, you're wrong. And if you don't think that the reason that the South has pushed criminal justice reform, and part of it is saving money, part of it is because of a new understanding of living in government and being suspicious of government, but part of it is they are terrified of the shift. And I do not think you're going to see huge outreaches in black barbershops across the United States. Not going to happen. But you might see a big push is in Latino communities. Like Compton now has become a Latino community. I was there recently and I saw like Republican offices and stuff in Compton. It's like, what the hell is that doing there? I never would have saw that there 15, 20 years ago. So, I'm not a Republican. I consider myself a classical liberal. I use the word conservative because nobody knows what a classical liberal is. But
education.
I seriously, every time I say that, they're like, so you're a Democrat? No. Okay, never mind. Just call me libertarian or whatever. But I do think that it is on the tip of the spear. And especially if you go to churches where a lot of conservatives are, it is a big part of what they're preaching today. Quite frankly, Jesus had a really rough time in the criminal justice system. And they talk about that routinely, and it is becoming part of the mantra on the center right. And I'm not saying this is for evil, forces. I am on the center right. But it is definitely everything that you're thinking about, sir, they're thinking about.
Along with building the wall and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, but the funny thing is that they've done polling. Many Hispanics that are actually voting Hispanics, they don't poll the same for those kind of questions as other individuals. It's actually kind of a weird statistic.
It's actually, it's sorry to interrupt, it's based on national origins.
Yeah.
So Dominicans poll very differently than
Yeah.
Cubans, than El Salvadorians, and that's
And a lot of the polling has been done by the center right.
Which is why race is such a conundrum in this conversation, because Black folk have 400 years of experience with the suggested goodwill of white folk. Immigrants don't. And many immigrants we work with, even within our network, tell me, Pastor Mike, I'm not the bad immigrant. I'm the good immigrant. And I tell them it does not matter what you think you are, because the powers that be, however you see them, don't believe you're white. Now, you can think you're white, but you will not be treated with the privileges of whiteness. Now, that analysis is lost on almost everyone who is not Black. And even some who are Black reach for whiteness thinking that it will save them until it doesn't. And so I do think this is why the race conversation, even within conservative right to center places that we're having, is critical. We cannot underestimate the way race plays in the background as an app that is always running but never attended to. And then we watch the demographics shift, and we now have white Latinos, white Black folk, and the melanin don't change, but your racial analysis is so deficient that you get the same outcomes that we've had previously before.
So Dean, Judge, Elaine, can I call on you at this moment?
Yes.
Because I do still want to have a little political conversation with our colleagues.
Okay, I'm only gonna say thank you all for allowing North Carolina Central University School of Law to host this very important work. I think we've just begun, but I also think that the conversations that we are having are necessary, and I hope that it will continue. The only last thing that I would like to add to the conversation is that while we are talking about the Square One project and what that means to reimagine justice, I do think that at some point we have to consider that there needs to be some parallel conversations that happen with other groups outside of the room. And I'll just take the Black experience for a second. Within the Black community, there are lots of things that we need to deal with and address in order for us to come together on some issues that will help us to define as a people, to the extent we can, what justice looks like when it is reimagined. And those conversations have to take place within the Black community. I also think that it has to happen in the white community. As I've often said, if you heard me say over the couple of days, you all hold the power, have held the power, and you continue to utilize that power for over 450 years. There's a process by which that is done, and you're going to have to talk to your relatives about how we are going to be integrated outside of your culture into this melting pot. America is changing. It's gonna change, and we have to be intentional about how we change together in a positive way. So thank you all.
Thank you again for both your hospitality, but more importantly, frankly, your contributions to our discussion are really rich. Elizabeth, when you run for office, you put on a different face from the face that you've had here in the public. How are you perceived? I'm going to ask just a quick answer, ask the same question of John. Just we need a little political reality here about how this works in the electoral process.
So everybody who knows me knows that I'm not capable of putting on a different face.
Okay, then I withdraw the
It is
question.
what it is. But I think that actually the dynamics in the where we run, district court judges run locally. And so the local politics really, drive what that ends up looking like and what those dynamics are. And they have really changed a lot in my district over the last 15 years. So like 15 years ago, I think people were feeling the impact of crime and their feeling of even the relevance of the criminal justice system very differently. 15 years ago, white upper middle class people were having their homes broken into, their cars broken into, And so they felt, you know, that what was happening in the justice system was relevant to their lives. And frankly, they pretty much rose up, marched on, you know, town hall kind of thing, demanding, you know, a response. And I think that for the most part, policy and practice in the justice system were developed to serve the needs of the white upper middle class, which has kind of been the case, right, forever. It's only, I think, in these last, I don't know, 8 to 10, maybe 8 years, that one, you know, we know crime is generally at an all-time low. In my community, whites aren't really feeling the impact of crime. Most of the victims of crime that are crimes involving victims are people of color. And so now what we have is a dynamic in which people of color are pretty angry and frustrated with a feeling of a system that is not treating them and their communities fairly, with dignity, and responding to their needs in meaningful ways. And so now that call is what I think is starting to drive policy and practice around criminal justice.
Don, and we started our time together here being somewhat surprised that you're running for office, but you're here.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what that means about your electoral prospects. Either they're very good or they're awful. What's it like on the campaign trail to talk?
Well, I mean, harkening back to when I started in 2010, I was probably the product of, I guess, the Democratic machine and all of the power interests that were behind that. So labor unions, the police federation, African-American community, strong support. And interestingly, you know, I got 54% of the vote. In 2010, it was a contested election. It was the incumbent had run for governor. But interestingly, all my votes came from the geographic areas, was kind of western part of the county. You know, I've won predominantly where it's high education, very liberal, and then where the African-American communities are, very high there. And then when you get out to the suburbs, and then when they're just the demographics, we're much older, I didn't do so well. But so since that time, you know, I think as the elected county attorney, I'm managing politics a lot. I mean, it's a lot of it's with a small p. Dealing with, like, I have a unionized staff, so I can't, if I can have policies, I could say certain things, but ultimately, if my staff doesn't want to do it, they're weebies, I call them. We be here longer than you. It's just a matter of time before you're gone, you know what I mean? So that's to manage
This is the
that.
powerlessness of the powerful, right?
Really?
They said it at the White House.
But it's a challenge to manage that. And so I have to be thinking about how to make change make sense to them, right? And then you've got kind of in my community, I've got just kind of a wide diversity of interests, politics. You know, there are some conservative locations and then also very progressive areas. But just trying to have everything that we're doing
So
making
does the
sense.
reform agenda that you've articulated and embodied, is that an issue? Is that something you?
No, majority of my population is progressive. And so, I mean, there are people on the right who think that I'm just a softie on crime. And, you know, we have the St. Paul Pioneer Press. They allow people to comment. I mean, there's just all these racist things that they say about me, or they say that I'm just, you know, letting off sex offenders or whatever it might be. But actually, I embrace that because one of the things I'm trying to be more intentional about in my leadership most recently is I've come to the conclusion that after listening to Brian Stevenson and and reading his Just Mercy, that I think that prosecutors really need to be talking more about those situations in which we're actually exercising our mercy. We're giving a second chance. We never talk about that.
Yeah.
We were bred to not talk about that. We were bred to pound our chest and say, I just got a 40-year sentence on a murderer, right? Aren't I great? And the people would say yes, right? And so I think that branding too is kind of, I'm in a process of trying to shift that a little bit.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Elizabeth, also. Bruce, we turn to you at the end of a long day in a warm room to help us think about the distance that we've traveled.
Yeah. So I heard today, I mean, it was an incredibly wide-ranging discussion. If we think back to where we started with, actually not with Leah, but with Jordan and the role of young people in a justice reform process. So I heard the overarching question that was being posed today as it emerged over the course of a long program is where is power? Where is power in this whole world in which we're operating? And there were at least two ideas about where is power. And one answer is it exists in agencies, and it exists in police departments and in prosecutors' offices and in courtrooms and departments of correction. And we had a discussion of, well, how important is it who is in leadership? Who are the chiefs? Who are the DAs? Who are the judges? And there was a consensus around the room that by itself, it wasn't enough that communities of color be represented in positions of leadership in those agencies. And partly, I think the answer is because the American criminal justice system is extraordinarily decentralized. There are many little locuses of power, and so the control, the level of control of any one leader in any one agency is limited. I think this is one reason why you get the answer, my hands are tied. Power is widely dispersed, and we heard something of the frustration about that situation when Elizabeth said this morning, who I thought was an absolute rock star this morning, when Elizabeth said, how do we set it right? And Ron said, how do I be a conscious warrior for justice? And one answer is that I think that emerged, you know, how can these leaders be empowered? I think we heard there are large reservoirs of discretion in fact, in these agencies that are held by leadership that are often not fully utilized, that are often dormant. They're accompanied by political risk, but that discretion exists. So there is real power there. And when I hear John talking about Brian Stevenson, I hear you say, I'm investigating how I can use my discretion in a different way, tap into that discretion and use it in a different way and make the choice for mercy with my powers of prosecution. One of the things I took away from the Justice in Durham meeting, in this setting where power is very dispersed and decentralized, there's enormous importance in coordination. And when different agencies, different actors are in conversation with each other, then much more can be done than by acting alone. And it seems like in a community like this, there is at least a reasonable level of coordination that's beginning to emerge around a pretty fundamental justice reform agenda, actually. So tapping into reservoirs of discretion, coordinating across agencies. So that's one idea of where is power. It exists in agencies. And then we had Monica's panel. And the other place in which power exists is in communities. And the community, she was urging us to think of the community as potentially a political actor. And it's not always a political actor, but it is potentially an agentic participant in processes of transformation. And that's not normally how we think about communities. We normally think about communities as sources of punitive sentiment, right? We normally think about communities as constraints on the discretion of leaders of agencies. But I took Monica's discussion as a much more open-ended idea of what community power could be, and something very much more than just a source of punitive sentiment that constrains all the goodwill of progressive agency leaders. And racial justice is a very important, potentially counterweight to all of the punitive sentiment that pushes communities towards status quo and in the direction of punishment. A community mobilized by racial justice it seems has enormous progressive potential. I thought the big implication coming out of the discussion around Monica's paper was that we should be thinking about criminal justice policy for its effects on social cohesion, the mobilization potential, the organizing potential of communities. And again, that struck me as a new idea. We typically don't think about we don't assess criminal justice policy in those sorts of terms. We think about what's the effect going to be on recidivism? What's the effect going to be on crime rates? What's the effect going to be on incarceration? But thinking about the effects of public policy, criminal justice policy, specifically on the social cohesion of communities, their power to mobilize, organize, share interest, be a political actor, struck me as a really, really important idea. Third and final thing. So H.D. Laswell, now I'm channeling Kerry. I'm sharing with you the sum total of my political science knowledge. H.D. Laswell said, politics is about who gets what, when, and how. But when it comes to race politics, that is not an adequate definition, because the entire political contest around race in America is a contest about citizenship and the fundamental rules of the game and who is in the political community, who gets to be a member of the political community that has voice and gets to influence political decision-making. And at some level, we thought that battle was over. We thought that battle was over in the 1960s and it was won, but it's not. And voting rights is a live front in the political contest over race in America. And in my thinking, there's a direct connection here to the discussion about criminal justice policy, because who gets to be in the political community is fundamentally a political conversation about dehumanization and humanization. Whose humanity is sufficiently present that they get to be in the political community with all of us. And that is the same conversation that's underneath the criminal justice reform conversation. And it sort of feels unfair. It feels that the battle over voting rights to us, for those on the progressive side, it feels unfair because that battle was meant to have been won 50 years ago. But that is the depth of racial injustice in this country. History hangs so heavily on this that we're still engaged in active political contest over who gets to be in the political community, and now this is, I mean, there's a really unresolved point at which to leave the conversation, but I think it's where Kerry has left us. Two final thoughts by way of conclusion. We've not talked a ton about two really fundamental political ideas. One is organization. Like how does organization actually happen on the ground, and what does that look like? And I wonder if we need to be talking about that more and in pretty granular detail. And the other thought is coalitions, organization coalitions, right? This is the bread and butter of politics. And we've talked about coalitions a little bit, and when it comes up, we always look to Art, and he is our reliable coalition partner.
Yeah, coalition of one.
Right, exactly. So we talk about left-right coalitions. Maybe we also ought to be talking about black-white coalitions, which we've not talked about, I think, enough in this conversation. So that's my wrap-up of a very wide-ranging day, and so I think we're free to go to the bar now.
You've earned time at the bar. I'm going to turn to Suki in a second for directions, but I want to point out first that we're here starting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Some of you wandered in a little bit late. I'd rather you be here on time if possible. In the first half hour, I just want to point this out to everybody, is for each of you, and everybody has to do this tomorrow, to do what Bruce just did, which is to reflect on our first 2 days. We want to start to develop a common language, a common experience, a framing of where we've been. Otherwise, it's going to feel like one after another after another. So my hope for tomorrow morning is that we'll be able to pull some threads through the conversation. Before we start with, Susan is going to be the one to kick off our discussion on reconciliation and reparation, etc. tomorrow morning, and thank you for doing that. Then we'll turn after the break to Nancy and Leah and their colleagues from Urban to help us think about what is happening in the world. I think Pastor Mike is absolutely right. It's a good time to lead with some ideas in mind rather than just feel like it's just too big for us to take on. And I'm going to leave you with this one totally self-serving idea, which I once had a conversation. This was after Bruce and I did the incarceration report. I was presenting on it at a panel, and Nick Turner from Bureau was there, and we were just sort of saying, oh, this is just so big. How do we reduce mass incarceration? We were talking about the scale of the number of people in prison and the amount of money we were spending. And so Nick lives in Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn. So in the taxi home, we came up with this devilish idea, which has now found its way in a sense into the participatory justice model. I said, we're going to secede from the state. We're going to take Brooklyn. We're just going to say, here's how much money is being spent in Brooklyn for the incarceration of people who are from Brooklyn, who, yeah, they committed crimes in Brooklyn, and it's $1 gazillion. So we're going to organize our political leaders and our community folks. We're just going to announce that we are no longer part of New York State for criminal justice purposes. And guess what? We want all that money home because we want to start spending it in Brooklyn for communities in Brooklyn to do things differently in Brooklyn. We never quite had the guts to do it, but there's a way to sort of think, big about starting with, let's take some money back where it belongs, right? So that's something we'll talk about tomorrow, but there's a food for thought as we leave. Okay, Suki, what are we going to do?
All right, well, our taxis are probably outside waiting for us. Tomorrow they'll be at the hotel at 8 a.m. And if you're not coming back tomorrow, please leave your name here. And Stephanie's going to walk from the hotel at 6:15 to the conference center. It is block away. It's very close. Look forward to tomorrow. I want to give a shout out to NCC's Full Laws Virtual Justice Project for streaming. People have been watching. and I think they're really impressed. Thank you to Raven for actively live tweeting everything that's been going on, some key moments. So thank you all for all of the awesome ammunition we have to give to the world. So thank you. And waiting for your next work.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Actually, one other quick thing, especially for the locals, we do still have seats available for tonight's Melissa Harris Perry program physically. So bring your family, invite your friends, all of that.
See you later. Safe travels.
I can't find this thing. I'm not on the text.
Yeah.
I don't.